I came home to find 30 years of my life stuffed into black trash bags on the wet grass. My daughter-in-law stood on the porch, arms crossed, and told me her father was moving into my bedroom. She thought she was kicking a broke retired plumber to the curb. She had no idea she had just evicted the man who owned the very ground she was standing on. And trust me, her regret was swift and absolute. Before I get into exactly how I dismantled her perfect little life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your elders should always come with a heavy price. I am Victor Rollins. Most people call me Vic. I am 73 years old. It was a Tuesday afternoon raining that cold, annoying drizzle that chills you right down to the bone. I had just come back from a quiet morning of fishing down at Lake Monroe. My old 2008 Chevy Silverado rumbled as I pulled into the driveway of the upscale suburban home I shared with my son Julian and his wife Chloe. But I did not make it to the front door. Scattered across the manicured front lawn were 5 black garbage bags. They were cheap, thin plastic, already tearing at the seams. Beside them sat a cardboard box getting soaked in the rain. I parked the truck and walked over, my boots squished in the wet grass. I looked down and saw my flannel shirts, my work boots, and my shaving kit spilling out onto the mud. And there, sitting right in the center of that soggy cardboard box, was a beautiful mahogany urn. My Vivian, my wife of 40 years, left out in the rain like discarded junk. I picked up the urn, wiping the raindrops from the polished wood with my sleeve. I felt a cold knot form in my chest, but I kept my face entirely blank. 40 years of building a commercial real estate empire in Chicago teaches you how to hide your emotions when the pressure is on. I looked up. Chloe was standing on the covered porch. She was 36, wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and holding a mug of artisanal coffee. She did not look guilty. She looked annoyed. Julian, my 40-year-old son, was standing just behind her, practically hiding in her shadow. He could not even meet my eyes. He stared at his expensive Italian leather shoes. "What is the meaning of this?" I asked. My voice was low, steady, and completely devoid of the panic Chloe was clearly hoping for. "My dad is moving in," Chloe said. Her tone was sharp, unapologetic. "He is having some issues with his apartment lease down in the city. He needs a place to stay, and with his arthritis he simply cannot be expected to walk up and down the stairs every day. He needs the master suite on the ground floor. Your room." I looked from her to Julian, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had worked double shifts for, making sure he went to the best private schools, making sure he never had to scrub a toilet or lay a brick in the freezing cold. "Julian," I said, "is this how it is?" Julian finally looked up, his face pale. "Dad, come on," he stammered. "It is just for a little while. Richard is in a tough spot. And honestly, Chloe and I have been talking. You need more specialized care anyway. We found a nice assisted living facility a few towns over. It is very affordable. You will be comfortable there." Affordable. He said the word like it was a favor to me. He thought I was broke. They both did. Because for the last 10 years, ever since Vivian passed, I played the part of a simple retired plumber scraping by on Social Security. I drove an old truck. I wore faded clothes. I never flaunted my money. Vivian always told me that wealth attracts parasites and poverty is the best filter for true character. Boy, was she right. Chloe stepped forward, resting a hand on her hip. "Let us be honest, Vic. You do not belong in a neighborhood like this anyway. You stick out. My dad fits the demographic here. He plays golf at the country club. He networks. Having him here is good for Julian's image at the firm. Having an old man tinkering with dirty tools in the garage and driving a rusted truck brings down the property value." She took a sip of her coffee, looking down at me on the wet lawn. "We packed everything you own. We even left you $50 for gas to get to the facility. The address is written on the back of an envelope in that box." I looked at the $50 bill fluttering under a paperweight inside the wet box. It was insulting. It was comical. I had given Julian $500 in cash every single month. I told him it was my contribution for groceries and utilities. I knew Chloe laughed at that amount. She called it my pathetic little allowance. She complained to her friends that her father-in-law was a freeloader, dropping spare change while she and Julian footed the real bills. What Chloe did not know was that the $500 was not for groceries. It was an exact cash reimbursement for the property taxes and the exorbitant homeowners association fees. Fees for a house that Julian thought he owned. He did not own it. I bought this property outright in cash 7 years ago through a blind trust. Julian was merely listed as a beneficiary resident under the strict legal condition that I resided in the home and was cared for until my death. But I did not say any of that. I did not scream. I did not yell about the money or the trust or the multi-million-dollar real estate development firm I had built from nothing and sold to a conglomerate just last year. Anger is a loud, messy thing. Retribution is silent. I held Vivian tightly against my chest. I looked at Julian one last time. He looked away again, ashamed but unwilling to stand up to his wife. He had made his choice. He chose the illusion of a wealthy lifestyle over the father who had bled to give it to him. "Understood," I said softly. Chloe smirked. She actually smiled a triumphant, wicked little grin. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully bullied a helpless old man out of his only shelter. "I am glad we are on the same page," she said, turning her back to me. "Have a safe drive, Vic." The front door clicked shut, the deadbolt engaged. I stood alone in the rain for a moment longer. I carefully placed Vivian inside the cab of the Silverado safely on the passenger seat. Then I grabbed the trash bags full of my clothes and tossed them into the truck bed. I did not take the $50. I left it there in the mud. Just as I closed the tailgate, a sleek silver BMW pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Richard, Chloe's father. He was 65, wearing pristine golf attire, a pastel polo shirt, and a smug expression. He popped the trunk and started pulling out custom leather golf bags. He saw me standing by my old truck in the rain. He paused, looking me up and down with that familiar subtle disgust he always wore around me. "Moving out, Vic," he called out, not offering a hand. "Shame. But you know how it is. Sometimes you have to make room for an upgrade. This neighborhood requires a certain pedigree, you understand." I looked at Richard. A man wearing expensive clothes, driving a leased luxury car, trying to act like royalty, while moving into a room that was not his. I knew men like Richard. All show no substance. A house of cards waiting for a strong breeze. "I understand perfectly, Richard," I replied. "Enjoy the house." I got into the driver's seat of my Chevy. I turned the key and the old engine roared to life. I put the truck in gear and slowly drove away from the beautiful 2-story brick house. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw Richard struggling to carry his heavy golf clubs up the driveway, acting as if he owned the world. They all thought they had won. They thought they had discarded a heavy burden. They had no idea that by locking that front door, they had just initiated their own financial and social ruin. I wiped the rainwater from my face. I reached under the driver's seat and pulled out a hidden compartment. Inside was a brand new smartphone, fully charged and disconnected from any family tracking plans. I looked over at the mahogany urn sitting on the passenger seat. "Well, Vivian," I whispered to my wife, "looks like it is time to go back to work." I sat in the driver's seat of my rusted Chevy Silverado for a long moment. The cold rain hammered against the windshield, blurring the view of the house I had bought with my own blood and sweat. I was ready to put the truck in gear and drive away. I was ready to leave them to their inevitable ruin. But as I patted my worn jacket pocket, a sharp realization hit me. My blood pressure medication was still sitting on the kitchen counter inside. A man does not build a multi-million-dollar real estate empire by being careless with his health, and I was going to need my health for what I was about to do. I turned off the ignition. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs. I stepped back out into the freezing drizzle. I walked slowly up the concrete driveway, stepping past the black plastic trash bags that contained 30 years of my life. As I approached the steps of the porch, a harsh, violent sound broke through the noise of the rain. It was the sound of heavy wood scraping aggressively against concrete. I stopped dead in my tracks at the bottom of the steps. Richard was there. Chloe's father was dragging a heavy wooden porch swing across the beautiful mahogany deck. It was not just any piece of furniture. I had built that swing with my own 2 hands over 3 decades ago. My late wife Vivian and I had spent an entire weekend painting it a soft, pristine white. We used to sit on that swing every summer evening, drinking sweet tea and watching the neighborhood children ride their bicycles down the street. It was her sanctuary. It still smelled like her favorite lavender perfume in my memory. Richard did not care. He heaved the swing over the edge of the porch with a grunt of exertion. It crashed down onto the wet grass right next to my bags of clothes. I heard a sickening crack as the left armrest splintered into jagged pieces. The wood we had sanded down so carefully was destroyed in a single careless second. I felt a surge of pure white-hot heat rise from my stomach to my throat. My fists clenched so tight my knuckles ached. but 40 years in the cutthroat business of commercial development teaches you absolute control. I kept my face entirely blank. I kept my breathing slow and steady. Richard brushed the dust off his hands and turned around. He did not look surprised to see me. He certainly did not look apologetic. Instead, he let out a short, arrogant laugh. He walked over to his silver BMW parked in the driveway and pulled out a massive custom leather golf bag. He dragged the heavy bag up the stairs and dropped it right in the exact spot where Vivian's swing had rested for years. "Sorry, old man," Richard said. His voice lacked even a fraction of genuine sorrow. He looked me up and down, taking in my faded flannel shirt and my wet boots with obvious disdain. "This house needs a little upgrade to match its class. You understand, right? We cannot have rusted old yard sale furniture ruining the aesthetic of a premium property. I need this open space for my clubs. I have some very important colleagues coming over this weekend for drinks before we hit the greens. You simply do not fit the demographic of this neighborhood anymore, Vic." "It is nothing personal, just real estate facts." I stared at his pristine, shiny golf clubs. They were the kind of clubs a man buys when he wants to look wealthy to his friends, not the kind a real athlete uses. The irony of his words almost made me laugh out loud. He was lecturing me about real estate facts. He was lecturing me about the class of a house that I legally owned. I thought about class. I thought about how, for the last 5 years, I had quietly handed my son Julian an envelope on the first day of every single month. Inside that envelope was exactly $500 in crisp cash. I always handed it to him with a humble smile, telling him it was just a little something from my pension to help out with the utility bills and the groceries. I played the part of the grateful burden, doing his best to contribute to the household. I remember the way Chloe would snatch that envelope from the kitchen counter. I remember hearing her complain loudly to her wealthy friends on the phone, making sure her voice carried into the living room where I was sitting. She would laugh a high-pitched, cruel laugh and say things like, "Julian's dad gave us his little allowance today. $500 barely covers our organic milk and wine for the week. It is completely embarrassing that we have to subsidize his life." She mocked that money constantly. She treated it like dirty spare change tossed by a beggar. What Chloe and Julian did not know, what they never bothered to calculate, was that the $500 was not a random number I pulled from a meager pension. It was the exact monthly cost of the property taxes and the exorbitant homeowners association fees for this specific property. I paid those fees in cash through them to maintain the legal illusion that they were the homeowners. By mocking that money, by treating my contribution as a joke, they were mocking the very foundation that kept a luxury roof over their arrogant heads. They thought I was a charity case. They did not realize I was the bank. I looked back at Richard. He was busy polishing a golf iron with a microfiber cloth, completely ignoring my presence on the lawn. I did not yell at him. I did not tell him that he was an uninvited guest squatting in a house funded by the man he was currently insulting. I just walked past him in complete silence. I opened the front door and stepped inside one last time. The house was dead quiet. Julian and Chloe were nowhere to be seen. They were probably hiding upstairs in their bedroom, avoiding the guilt of watching me leave in the rain. I grabbed my small medication bag from the marble kitchen counter. I walked back out onto the porch. Richard did not even look up. "Enjoy the upgrade, Richard," I said quietly. "Make yourself very comfortable." I walked down the steps and back to my truck. I climbed inside the cold, damp cabin and locked the doors. I started the engine, hearing the familiar deep rumble of the old motor. I drove away, leaving my trash bags and my wife's broken wooden swing on the lawn. I would buy that swing back later, but right now, I had bigger plans. I navigated the winding, pristine streets of the gated community. The massive oak trees and perfectly manicured lawns passed by my rain-slicked windows. I drove past the main security gate where the guard waved at my old truck without a second glance. The moment the luxury neighborhood was out of sight and I merged onto the main highway, I pulled the truck over to the shoulder of the road. I put the vehicle in park. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my battered flip phone. It was a cheap, prepaid model with huge buttons. The exact kind of phone people buy for elderly relatives because they assume we cannot understand modern technology. Chloe always rolled her eyes in profound irritation whenever I pulled it out to make a call. I looked at the small screen for a second. Then I opened the back cover. I pulled out the cheap battery. I removed the tiny SIM card and snapped it perfectly in half with my thumb. I rolled down my window and tossed the broken pieces and the plastic phone straight into a rushing storm drain. It disappeared into the dark water instantly. That helpless old man was dead. He washed away down the drain. I reached down under the driver's seat of my truck. My fingers traced the metal frame until they found the hidden biometric latch I had custom installed years ago. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A small steel lockbox slid out silently. I opened the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a piece of black velvet, was a brand new state-of-the-art smartphone. It was a high-end encrypted device tied to a private corporate network that absolutely no one in my family knew existed. I picked it up, feeling the cool glass and a metal in my palm. I pressed the power button. The bright screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark cabin of my truck with a sharp blue light. I connected to my private server, bypassing all standard tracking. I sat up straight. The posture of a weary old man vanished completely, replaced by the rigid spine of a corporate titan who had crushed rivals for breakfast. It was time to make some phone calls. It was time to show my son, his cruel wife, and her arrogant father exactly what true class and absolute power really look like. The drive from the upscale suburbs into the heart of the city took 45 minutes. The heavy rain washed over the windshield of my rusted Chevy Silverado, acting as a perfect baptism. With every mile that passed, the persona of the frail, dependent old man washed away, leaving behind the hardened, calculated architect of a real estate empire. I bypassed the modest motels on the highway and drove straight into the downtown financial district, pulling my battered truck right up to the grand illuminated entrance of the Waldorf Astoria. The valet, a young kid in a pristine uniform, stepped forward and froze. He looked at my truck dented and caked in suburban mud and then looked at the line of Bentleys and Porsches waiting behind me. He hesitated, unsure if he should open my door or ask me to move along to the service entrance. I did not give him the chance to decide. I stepped out into the rain wearing my wet boots and my faded flannel shirt and handed him the keys. "Park it carefully, son," I said, handing him a crisp $100 bill. His eyes widened and he immediately stood at attention, nodding as he took the keys. I walked through the heavy revolving doors and stepped into the lobby. It was a cathedral of marble crystal chandeliers and quiet wealth. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. I walked across the polished floor, my heavy boots squeaking slightly, drawing the eyes of well-dressed guests who quickly looked away. I approached the front desk. A young man in a sharp, tailored suit looked up from his computer. He took one look at my wet clothes, my weathered face, and my calloused hands. His professional smile tightened into a polite but firm mask. He had been trained to handle vagrants without causing a scene. "Good evening, sir," he said, his voice dripping with that polished corporate condescension. "I am afraid if you are looking to get out of the rain, the public transit station is just 2 blocks down the street. Our lobby is reserved for hotel guests only." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I leaned slightly against the cold marble counter and looked him dead in the eye. "Good evening," I said, my voice deep and unwavering. "I need a suite. The largest one you have available. I will be staying indefinitely." The young man let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "Sir, I assure you we are completely fully booked. And even if we were not, our standard rooms begin at over $1,000 a night. Perhaps there is a more suitable accommodation for you outside the downtown area." He reached for a notepad, clearly intending to write down the address of a cheap motel. I reached into my wet jacket pocket. I did not pull out a worn leather wallet. I pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion card, the infamous black card. I placed it flat on the marble counter. It made a heavy, distinct clink that echoed in the quiet lobby. I placed my platinum driver license right next to it. The clerk looked down. He saw the black metal. He saw the name embossed in silver, Victor Rollins. I watched the color completely drain from his face. In this city, the name Rollins was stamped on the sides of skyscrapers, luxury condominiums, and commercial plazas. He realized, in a fraction of a second, that he had just tried to kick out one of the most powerful real estate developers in the state. "My apologies, Mr. Rollins," he stammered, his hands visibly shaking as he quickly typed into his keyboard. "I am so sorry. I did not recognize you. We actually have the presidential suite available on the top floor. It will be ready for you immediately." "I will need total privacy," I told him, picking up my card. "No phone calls transferred to my room unless I approve them. No visitors. If anyone calls asking if I am a guest here, you tell them you have no one by that name." "Absolutely, sir," he said, handing me the golden keycard with both hands. 5 minutes later, I was standing in the center of a 3,000-square-foot penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glowing city skyline. I walked into the massive marble bathroom, stripped off my wet, pathetic disguise, and took a long, burning hot shower. When I stepped out, I wrapped myself in a thick plush robe. I walked over to the fully stocked mahogany bar, poured myself a neat glass of 20-year-old bourbon, and sat down in a leather armchair overlooking the city. I picked up my encrypted smartphone. It was time to make the call that would set the demolition in motion. I dialed a private number. It rang twice before a sharp, commanding voice answered. Sterling Pierce, attorney at law. Sterling was a 60-year-old African-American bulldog of a lawyer. We had grown up in the same rough neighborhoods on the South Side. I built buildings and he built airtight legal fortresses. He was the only man who knew the absolute entirety of my wealth and my strategies. Vic Sterling said, his tone shifting from professional to familiar. It is late. Do not tell me you are calling about the downtown zoning permits at this hour. No, Sterling, I replied, taking a slow sip of the bourbon. I am calling about Julian and Chloe. They just threw my belongings out onto the front lawn. Her father is moving into my bedroom as we speak. There was a heavy, pregnant silence on the other end of the line. When Sterling spoke again, his voice was ice cold. They actually did it. They kicked you out. They did. I confirmed. Julian stood right there and let it happen. They told me to go to an assisted living facility. They think I am destitute, Sterling. Chloe even had the nerve to leave me a $50 bill in a cardboard box for gas money. I heard Sterling let out a low, dark chuckle, a laugh that meant someone was about to lose absolutely everything. $50, Sterling repeated. She left a multimillionaire $50. Vic, please tell me you are ready to drop the hammer. I have been sitting on this paperwork for 5 years, waiting for that boy to show his true colors. I am ready, I said. Walk me through the exact legal standing of the property as of tonight. Sterling shuffled some papers on his desk. The house is entirely owned by the Rollins Family Revocable Living Trust, of which you are the sole trustee and grantor. Julian is listed purely as a conditional beneficiary resident. The singular non-negotiable condition of his residency in that home is that he provides you with adequate shelter care and residence until the day you die. So I murmured, staring out at the city lights. By placing my belongings in the yard and telling me to leave, what exactly did my son do? He breached the primary covenant of the trust, Sterling said sharply. Legally speaking, the moment you drove away from that property under duress, Julian forfeited his right to live there. He is no longer a beneficiary. He and his wife and his arrogant father-in-law are now legally classified as unauthorized squatters trespassing on corporate property. Draft the eviction notices I ordered, but do not file them yet. I want them to get comfortable first. I want Richard to unpack his expensive golf clubs. I want Chloe to start redecorating my room. Let them think they have won. We are going to tighten the noose slowly. Understood, Sterling said. What is your first move? I smiled in the empty, luxurious room. It was a cold, calculated smile. Contact the bank, I instructed. I want to cancel a specific recurring transfer. You know, the $500 I hand Julian in cash every month. The money Chloe calls my pathetic allowance. Yes, Sterling said. The exact amount that automatically transfers from Julian's account to the Neighborhood Homeowners Association and the county property tax escrow. Exactly, I said. For 5 years I have been making cash deposits into Julian's account, and my corporate office automatically pulls that exact amount to keep their luxury lifestyle afloat. I want you to sever the corporate payment link tonight. Do not notify them. Let the automated payment fail. Sterling laughed again. Vic, the HOA in that neighborhood is notoriously ruthless. If that payment bounces, they will slap Julian with a $500 late fee on day one. By the end of the week, they will issue a formal warning of property liens. That is the point, I said softly. Chloe thinks I am a charity case. Julian thinks he is a self-made man. It is time they find out how expensive it is to live in a mansion when the invisible safety net suddenly vanishes. Consider it done, Sterling said. Have a good night, Vic. Welcome back to the land of the living. I ended the call and placed the phone on the glass coffee table. I took another slow sip of my bourbon, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The rain continued to beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential suite. Somewhere out in the wealthy suburbs, my son and his wife were sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that their financial execution had just been ordered. I looked at the mahogany urn resting safely on the marble mantel across the room. I promised you I would test his character, Vivian, I whispered to the empty room. He failed. Now he gets to face the consequences. 3 days passed since I checked into the presidential suite at the Waldorf Astoria. I spent my mornings drinking premium black coffee and reviewing the financial dossiers my lawyer Sterling sent over. My son and his wife were living on borrowed time and borrowed money. They were a house of cards waiting for a strong gust of wind. But the real entertainment started on a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the city when my secure smartphone buzzed with a notification from my private bank. An attempted transaction had just been blocked. I opened the alert and a slow, calculated smile spread across my face. Let me explain something about Chloe. She always thought she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. A few months ago, a piece of my mail went missing from the kitchen counter. It was a secondary credit card, a basic account I kept active for minor hardware store purchases and random expenses. I knew exactly who took it. I never reported it stolen because a good fisherman knows you have to use the right bait to catch a predator. I left the card unblocked because I wanted to see exactly how greedy she would get. She held onto it waiting for the perfect moment. And kicking me out of the house was apparently the green light she needed to start spending what she thought was a senile old man's money. My banking application showed the exact location of the attempted charge. Chloe was at an exclusive boutique downtown called the Artisan Loft. It is the kind of place where a single decorative pillow costs more than a regular person's monthly mortgage payment. She was trying to spend $8,500 on a custom bedroom furniture set. No doubt she wanted to make her father Richard feel like absolute royalty as he moved into my old ground floor suite. I could picture the scene perfectly. She probably strolled into the showroom acting like she owned the entire building. She probably pointed at expensive Italian leather headboards and solid oak dressers while treating the sales staff like personal servants. When the time came to pay, she confidently handed the clerk my card. She assumed that since I was a lonely, discarded old man, I would never check the statements, or I would be too confused to notice the massive balance. But Sterling had already executed my orders. Every single personal and corporate account tied to my name was locked down tighter than a federal vault. The clerk ran the card. Declined. I am sure Chloe laughed it off at first, blaming the machine or complaining about bank security algorithms. She probably told the clerk to run it again with that arrogant tone she perfected. Declined. The notification on my phone showed 4 consecutive attempts in the span of 2 minutes. By the 4th try, the store manager would have stepped in. I know exactly how those luxury boutiques operate. They look at you very differently when your credit card bounces. The fake retail smiles drop immediately. The polite customer service turns into cold, silent suspicion. Chloe was standing there in her expensive designer clothes, utterly humiliated as the staff realized she could not afford the very things she was demanding. She had no other way to pay the bill. I knew from Sterling's background check that her own credit cards were completely maxed out. She had to walk out of that store empty-handed while the sales clerks watched her retreat. Her pride was shattered into pieces right in the middle of a high-end showroom. But her bad day was just getting started. While Chloe was suffering the consequences of her own theft downtown, Julian was about to experience his own financial nightmare right in our driveway. You see, Julian drove a brand new black Tesla Model S. He loved that car more than he loved most people. He always parked it right at the very edge of the driveway so all the wealthy neighbors could see it. He told everyone at his firm that he bought it with a massive year-end bonus. That was a complete lie. He leased it, and he was 4 months behind on the payments. I used to quietly slip him extra cash to cover the arrears so he would not lose face, but that invisible safety net was gone now. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my tablet chimed with a silent alert. It was a notification from the discreet security cameras I had custom installed around the exterior of the house long before they ever thought about kicking me out. I opened the live video feed. A heavy-duty diesel tow truck was backing slowly into the driveway. The flashing yellow lights illuminated the pouring rain reflecting off the pristine paint of the Tesla. 2 men in thick raincoats jumped out and quickly hooked up the front wheels of the luxury vehicle. The front door of the house burst open. Julian ran out into the freezing rain wearing nothing but expensive silk pajamas and a panic-stricken expression. He was waving his arms wildly, shouting at the repo men. I turned up the audio feed on my tablet. Julian was begging them to unhook the car. He promised he would make a double payment the very next morning. He tried to explain who he was and how important his job was. The repo man just shook his head, wiping rain from his face, and handed Julian a laminated piece of paper. You cannot negotiate with a tow truck driver holding a legal bank order. I watched my 40-year-old son stand barefoot in the cold mud as his ultimate status symbol was dragged away into the dark street. The noise of the tow truck woke up the neighborhood. I saw the porch lights turn on at the house next door. Mrs. Gable, a notorious neighborhood gossip, was standing at her window, watching the entire humiliating spectacle. Julian looked small. He looked desperate and entirely powerless. And then he did exactly what I knew he would do. He reached into his pajama pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a number he had called countless times before when he was in trouble. A second later, the automated voice from my telecom provider echoed faintly through the security camera audio. The number you have reached is no longer in service. Julian stared at his glowing phone screen in absolute shock. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He dialed again, his fingers shaking. The same automated voice replied. He had tried to call his poor old dad for a quick bailout. He honestly thought he could just cry on the phone, tell me he made a terrible mistake, and ask for a few $1,000s to get his luxury car back from the impound lot. But the old flip phone he was calling was sitting in broken pieces at the bottom of a storm drain. The man he relied on to clean up his messes was officially gone. The next morning, the atmosphere inside that house must have been absolutely toxic. Chloe had no new furniture to impress her arrogant father. Julian had no luxury car to drive to his prestigious firm. He probably had to order a rideshare just to get to work. The walls of their fake wealth were closing in on them rapidly. They were bleeding cash, and they had absolutely no way to stop the bleeding. I kept the security feed running on a secondary monitor in my suite while I ate my breakfast. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, I saw Chloe storm out the back door and walk into the detached garage. She was pacing back and forth, talking frantically on her phone. She was looking for something, anything of value to liquidate. They needed fast cash to save their sinking ship. Then she stopped pacing. She was staring directly at the back wall of the garage. Against that wall sat my vintage tool collection and several antique clocks I had meticulously restored over the years. We are not talking about cheap hammers and rusty nails from a local hardware store. These were rare 19th century woodworking tools, pristine hand planes, and solid brass levels. Collectors pay tens of thousands of dollars for authentic items like those. Vivian and I spent decades traveling the country hunting for them at exclusive estate sales. Through the camera, I watched Chloe walk over to the locked display cabinets. She found the spare key I kept hidden under a workbench. She opened the glass doors and picked up a solid bronze antique plane, examining it closely. I could almost see the greed calculating in her eyes. She pulled out her phone and started taking high-resolution pictures of the entire collection. She opened every drawer, photographing every rare silver wrench and every beautifully restored mantel clock. She thought it was just a bunch of old junk left behind by a senile retired plumber. She figured she could post the items online and sell them for a few $100 to cover their immediate debts. She had no idea she was handling historical artifacts worth more than her entire college education. She justified it to herself by assuming I had abandoned the property so it was rightfully hers to sell. I took a slow sip of my coffee and smiled. She was actively planning to sell property that did not belong to her. Property housed inside a garage she had no legal right to occupy. The trap was setting itself flawlessly. She thought she was finding a clever way out of her financial hole, but all she was doing was handing me the exact evidence I needed to put her in a real prison. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Sterling. I told my lawyer to get a private appraiser ready and to begin heavily monitoring all the local online auction sites. Chloe was about to cross the line from being a cruel daughter-in-law to a felony criminal, and I was going to make sure the entire world watched her fall. I was sitting at the massive mahogany dining table in my penthouse suite when Sterling Pierce walked in. He did not bother knocking. He had a golden keycard and a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. He poured himself a glass of water from the wet bar and sat down directly across from me. He looked like a predator who had just found a wounded animal in the woods. He slid the folder across the polished wood. I opened it. It was the background check from the private investigator we had hired to look into Richard. Let me remind you about Richard. He was the man who dragged my wife's antique swing off the porch to make room for his golf clubs. He was the man who told me I did not fit the demographic of my own neighborhood. He carried himself like a retired Wall Street titan. He wore pastel polo shirts and talked about his colleagues at the country club. He looked down on me because I wore faded flannel and drove a rusted truck. But the documents in front of me told a very different story. Richard was a fraud. He was a complete and absolute failure. He was not having minor issues with his apartment lease down in the city. He had been formally evicted by the county sheriff's department. The private investigator found that Richard had been running a shady investment scheme for years, borrowing money from dangerous people to fund a severe gambling addiction. He lost everything. His luxury car was a lease he had not paid in 6 months. His country club membership had been quietly revoked for unpaid dues long ago. Sterling leaned back in his chair and smiled. Richard is not moving into your house to enjoy his golden years, Vic. He is hiding. He is hiding from creditors, angry investors, and bookies who want to break his legs. He targeted your son's house because it is in a gated community with private security. He needed a fortress to hide in, and Chloe gave him yours. I read through the financial statements. It was pathetic. This arrogant man who looked down his nose at my calloused hands had absolutely nothing to his name except crushing debt and a fake, aristocratic accent. He was a parasite looking for a new host. But the folder contained something even more disturbing. Our investigator had dug deeply into the shared bank accounts that Julian and Chloe used. I already knew Julian was struggling because he was 4 months behind on his car payments. But the bank statements showed something far more sinister happening right under my son's nose. Chloe was actively bleeding her husband dry. Over the past 3 weeks, large sums of money had been wired from Julian's primary savings account to a series of offshore holding companies. The investigator tracked the routing numbers. Those holding companies belonged to the bookies and angry creditors chasing Richard. Chloe was stealing Julian's hard-earned money to pay off her father's gambling debts. She was funneling thousands of dollars out of their joint accounts while Julian was busy working 60-hour weeks at his firm. He had no idea. He was stressing over his repossessed Tesla, completely unaware that his wife was the one bankrupting him from the inside out just to save her deadbeat father. I closed the folder and let out a heavy breath. I thought about Julian. 40 years ago, I carried that boy on my shoulders. I promised Vivian I would protect him. I gave him every advantage I never had growing up on the South Side. I paid for his education so he would never have to lay a brick in the freezing cold. And now he was a weak, blind man, letting a manipulative woman and a cowardly old fraud destroy his life. Part of me wanted to call him. Part of me wanted to drive to his office, slam these bank statements on his desk, and shake him until he woke up. I wanted to tell him that the woman he married was transferring his future to criminals, but I knew that would not work. Julian was blinded by his desire to fit into her world. If I tried to warn him, Chloe would just spin another web of lies. She would cry, she would manipulate him, and she would convince him that his crazy old father was trying to ruin their marriage out of spite. Number Julian had made his bed when he watched them throw my belongings onto the wet grass and said absolutely nothing. He had to lie in it. He had to feel the fire burn before he would ever understand the danger he was in. A man cannot be saved if he refuses to see the chains around his own wrists. Sterling watched my face closely. He knew me well enough to know I was not feeling pity. I was calculating the drop. "What is the play, Vic?" he asked quietly. "Do we send this file to the police? Do we let the authorities drag Richard out of the house in handcuffs?" "Not yet," I replied. "Sending Richard to jail right now would be too easy. It would take him out of the house, which is exactly what Julian needs to survive. I do not want to solve their problems for them. I want them to drown in them." Richard is a man built entirely on false pride. He lives for the illusion of wealth. If we take away his freedom, he just plays the victim. But if we take away his pride, his illusion, and his social standing in front of the people he desperately wants to impress, we destroy him completely. I told Sterling to keep monitoring the bank accounts. Let Chloe keep stealing from Julian. Let her funnel every last cent into her father's black hole of debt until there is nothing left. Let them feel the false security of having a luxury roof over their heads. Because I knew exactly what a man like Richard would do next. A man who is desperate to maintain his wealthy facade always overcompensates when he feels cornered. Now that he was safely inside a multi-million-dollar home in a gated community, he would want to show it off. He would want to invite those snobby country club friends over to prove he was still a man of high status. He would try to use my house to rebuild his shattered reputation and pretend he was still on top of the world. And when he did, I was going to be there. I was going to let him build his stage, gather his audience, and then I was going to pull the floor right out from under him. But first, we needed to turn up the heat. Richard was getting too comfortable in his new environment, and he lacked the discipline to respect the rules of a high-end neighborhood. "Get the Homeowners Association Management Company on the line," I told Sterling. "You know, the property management firm that my development company secretly owns. Tell the board directors to start strictly enforcing every single neighborhood bylaw on that specific address. I want daily inspections. If Richard thinks he can hide in my house for free, he is about to find out that the neighborhood has a very strict policy against uninvited trash." Sterling smiled, packing the thick manila folder back into his leather briefcase. It was the kind of smile that promised absolute devastation. The trap was set. The financial walls were closing in on Chloe and Julian, and Richard was about to learn that pretending to be rich is a very dangerous game when you are playing in a house owned by a man who actually is. I was sitting in the leather armchair of my penthouse suite at the Waldorf Astoria when the notification chimed on my encrypted tablet. It was a message from the private investigator Sterling had hired. The message contained a single link to a local online marketplace and a brief note that said, "You need to see this immediately." I clicked the link and the screen loaded a new advertisement posted just 20 minutes ago. The title of the listing read, "Old Carpentry Junk and Antique Clocks for Quick Sale." My heart turned to absolute ice. I stared at the high-resolution photographs uploaded to the website. There on the screen was my entire life history, laid out on the dirty concrete floor of my garage. I saw my 19th century Stanley metal planes. I saw the custom brass levels I had used to frame the very first apartment building I ever developed on the south side of Chicago. I saw the grand mahogany mantel clock that Vivian and I had purchased on our 10th wedding anniversary. These were not just tools or decorations. These were the sacred artifacts of my survival. They were the blood and sweat that built the Rollins real estate empire. Chloe had broken the locks on my display cabinets. She had dragged my meticulously maintained antiques out of their velvet-lined drawers and tossed them into cheap cardboard moving boxes. And the most insulting part of it all was the price tag she had placed on the listing. She was asking for $1,200 for the entire lot. The antique mantel clock alone had recently been appraised at over $25,000. The vintage woodworking tools were highly sought after collector items worth easily another $30,000. She was trying to liquidate $50,000 of my personal property for the price of a cheap television. She was desperate. Richard was drowning in gambling debts and his dangerous creditors were closing in on them. Chloe needed fast, untraceable cash to keep her arrogant father safe, and she had decided that stealing from the old man she had just kicked out was the easiest way to get it. My phone rang loudly on the glass table. It was Sterling. My lawyer was absolutely furious. His voice boomed through the speaker. "Vic, tell me you are looking at the same website I am looking at right now. Tell me you see what that entitled woman is doing to your property. I am calling the police chief right now. We are sending a squad car to the house. We are going to have her arrested for grand larceny before she can hand those items over to some random pawn shop." I took a slow sip of my black coffee. I watched the city traffic moving silently far below my window. "Calm down, Sterling," I said. My voice was completely steady. My calmness seemed to frustrate him even more. "Calm down," he repeated. "Vic, she is actively fencing stolen goods across state lines using the internet. She is committing a federal crime right in your garage. If she sells those tools to a stranger, you might never get them back. If we send the police right now, she will play the victim," I explained patiently. "You know exactly how a woman like Chloe operates. She will cry. She will tell the police that it was a simple misunderstanding. She will claim that I abandoned the property and told her to clear out the garage. She will use her tears and her expensive clothes to manipulate the situation. The police might just call it a civil domestic dispute and walk away. I do not want a domestic dispute, Sterling. I want a felony conviction with absolutely no room for negotiation. We are not going to stop her from selling my property. We are going to help her do it." Sterling fell silent on the other end of the line. His legal mind caught up to my strategy instantly. "You want to set up a controlled buy?" he asked quietly. "Exactly," I replied. "Call Thomas." Thomas was one of the best acquisitions brokers my development firm employed. He was a master negotiator who usually handled multi-million-dollar commercial land acquisitions. Buying a few boxes of antiques from a desperate amateur would be incredibly easy for him. I gave Sterling the exact instructions. I told him to have Thomas put on a pair of casual jeans and a simple jacket. I told him to rent a generic moving van so his luxury corporate vehicle would not raise any suspicions. Thomas was to withdraw $3,000 in cash from the corporate petty cash fund, but most importantly, Thomas had to wear a hidden button camera. I wanted high-definition video and audio of the entire transaction. I wanted to see her face and hear her lies. Within an hour, the trap was perfectly set. I sat in my hotel suite watching the live video feed stream directly to my laptop. The camera lens was hidden in the button of Thomas' jacket. I watched as he pulled the rented van into the driveway of my house. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy and gray. Thomas walked up to the garage and knocked. The heavy door slowly rolled up. There stood Chloe. She was wearing designer yoga pants and an expensive silk top paid for by my secret monthly deposits. She looked nervous, but her eyes lit up with absolute greed when she saw Thomas standing there. She led him into the garage. I felt a surge of cold anger when I saw how carelessly she had treated my tools. She kicked one of the cardboard boxes toward Thomas. "There is a lot of old junk in here," she said dismissively. "Heavy metal things and some old clocks. I just want it all gone today. It is completely ruining the aesthetic of my home." She actually used the word aesthetic. She was standing in a garage I owned, talking about the aesthetic of a house I paid for while trying to sell the tools that built her entire lifestyle. "Where did you get all these beautiful pieces?" Thomas asked, playing the part of an eager local collector. Chloe did not even hesitate. She lied with the smooth, effortless practice of a true sociopath. "They belonged to my late grandfather," she said, putting a hand on her hip. "He was a carpenter or something like that. He left them to me when he passed away last year. I kept them for sentimental reasons, but honestly they are just taking up space now. I am redecorating the entire house, and this junk simply does not fit my vision." I watched her lie about my life. I watched her erase my existence and claim my history as her own. It was a masterclass in arrogance. "How much do you want for everything?" Thomas asked, looking down at the boxes. Chloe crossed her arms. $2,000 cash, she demanded. "It is a very fair price for all this heavy vintage metal." Thomas was a professional. He knew that agreeing too quickly would make her suspicious. He rubbed his chin and pretended to inspect the mahogany clock. "I do not know," he said slowly. "It is going to take a lot of work to clean this up. I can give you $1,500 right now, cash in hand, and I will load it all myself." Chloe tried to hide her relief, but I could see the tension leave her shoulders. "Deal," she said quickly. "Just get it out of my garage." Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope of $100 bills. Chloe reached for the money instantly, but Thomas pulled it back just an inch. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out a clipboard with a single sheet of paper attached to it. "Before I hand over the cash, I just need you to sign this standard bill of sale," Thomas said with a polite smile. "I run a legitimate antique business and my accountant needs a paper trail for tax purposes. It just says that you are the legal owner of these items and that you have the right to sell them to me. Standard boilerplate stuff." Chloe rolled her eyes, clearly annoyed by the paperwork delaying her payday. "Give me the pen," she said impatiently. She did not read a single line of the document. If she had read it, she would have seen the strict legal clauses Sterling had drafted. The document explicitly stated that the seller was the sole and absolute legal owner of the property. It stated that the items were free of any liens, claims, or disputes. It was a legally binding contract confirming that she was knowingly and willingly taking responsibility for the sale. She grabbed the pen and signed her full legal name at the bottom of the page. She signed away her entire future for $1,500 in crumpled paper. Thomas handed her the cash. She shoved the envelope into her designer pocket without even counting it properly. She stood back and watched as Thomas carefully loaded the boxes and the antique clocks into the back of his van. She told him to hurry up because she had a manicure appointment she could not be late for. As soon as the last box was loaded, she pressed the button to close the garage door, shutting Thomas out. I watched the live feed as Thomas climbed into the van and drove away from the neighborhood. He drove straight to a secure climate-controlled storage facility owned by my corporate office. My tools and my wife's clock were completely safe. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Sterling. "We have it, Vic," the lawyer said. His voice was filled with a dark, triumphant satisfaction. "Thomas just uploaded a high-resolution scan of the signed bill of sale. We have the video of her claiming the items belonged to her grandfather. We have the video of her taking the cash. We have her signature on a fraudulent legal document." "What is her exact legal exposure?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. Sterling let out a dry laugh. By posting the items online, crossing state digital commerce lines, and selling property valued at over $50,000, Chloe has committed felony grand theft, felony wire fraud, and trafficking in stolen goods. The signed bill of sale removes any possible defense of ignorance or misunderstanding. She documented her own crime perfectly. If we hand this file to the district attorney today, she is looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a state penitentiary. The legal noose was officially tied. Chloe thought she had solved her immediate cash flow problem. She thought she had outsmarted a helpless old man and saved her arrogant father from his violent creditors. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the precise weapon I needed to destroy her entirely. I looked out the window at the sprawling city. The trap was springing shut exactly as I had designed it. Chloe had sold her soul for a handful of cash, and very soon I was going to collect the debt. Chloe sold my tools for a fraction of their true value. She handed that stolen cash directly to her father. Richard used that money to temporarily buy off his aggressive creditors. With the immediate threat of violence removed from his life, Richard grew incredibly bold. He forgot he was an uninvited guest. He decided it was time to establish his dominance in the neighborhood. He wanted to prove to the wealthy residents of my gated community that he belonged there. But Richard did not know how real wealth behaved. He only knew the loud, obnoxious stereotypes of fake money. On a sunny Saturday afternoon, I watched my security monitor in absolute disbelief. A massive, rusted recreational vehicle rumbled into the pristine driveway of my property. It was a 30-foot monstrosity leaking dark engine oil all over the custom-imported paving stones I had installed 5 years ago. Richard stepped out of the driver's seat wearing a pastel polo shirt and a smug grin. He was followed by 3 of his shady associates, men who looked like they spent their lives dodging tax collectors and running illegal poker games. They dragged a huge rusted charcoal grill out of the vehicle and set it up right in the middle of the manicured front lawn. Within an hour, thick black smoke was billowing toward the second-story windows. Obnoxious loud music blared from cheap portable speakers. Empty beer cans littered the grass. The upscale neighbors were absolutely horrified. I could see Mrs. Gable from next door standing on her porch with her phone to her ear, frantically calling the community security patrol. In an exclusive neighborhood like this, you do not even paint your front door without submitting a formal architectural request. You certainly do not park an oil-leaking recreational vehicle in the driveway and turn the front lawn into a cheap tailgate party. Richard was completely oblivious to the disgusted stares of the community. He was holding a pair of grilling tongs, laughing loudly and acting like the lord of the manor. He thought because he had bullied a retired old plumber out of the house, he was completely untouchable. He had no idea how wrong he was. Upscale gated communities are not governed by local police. They are governed by the homeowners association. The HOA is a ruthless entity that controls everything from the height of your grass to the exact shade of beige you are allowed to paint your mailbox. Chloe used to complain endlessly about the HOA board, calling them a bunch of nosy dictators who had nothing better to do than write violation tickets. What my foolish daughter-in-law did not know was that the private management firm contracted to run that specific homeowners association was a direct subsidiary of Rollins Development. I built that entire subdivision. I wrote the original community bylaws. I owned the company that enforced the rules. I picked up my secure smartphone and dialed the direct line to the regional director of my property management division. He answered on the first ring. I told him to pull up the security file for my address. I listened as he gasped in shock over the phone when he saw the live footage of the recreational vehicle and the smoke on the lawn. I gave him very specific and very ruthless orders. I told him to enforce every single community bylaw with maximum extreme prejudice. I wanted 0 warnings. I wanted 0 grace periods. I wanted immediate compounding fines. The director read the bylaws back to me. Unauthorized recreational vehicle parked in a residential driveway outside of loading hours. That is a fine of $1,000 per day. Unapproved open flame apparatus located less than 20 feet from a residential structure. That is a fine of $500 per violation. Noise violations exceeding community decibel limits during restricted hours. That is another $500. I told the director to print the official violation notices on heavy red cardstock. I wanted a neighborhood security officer to tape those bright red envelopes directly to the center of the front door every single morning at exactly 7 o'clock. For a full week, Richard kept his ugly vehicle parked in my driveway. He and Chloe ignored the first few red envelopes. I watched on the cameras as Chloe ripped the notices off the door and threw them into the trash without even opening them. Arrogant people always assume that rules apply to everyone else but them. They assume that if they ignore a problem, it will magically disappear. But the fines compounded daily. Every 24 hours, a new bright red notice was taped to the mahogany door. Every 24 hours, another $2,000 was added to their ledger. By the end of the 7th day, the total balance of fines and late penalties reached exactly $15,000. And the absolute beauty of this specific homeowners association contract was the enforcement clause. The bylaws clearly stated that if fines were not paid in full within 10 days, the management company had the legal right to place a lien on the property and initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. The hammer finally dropped on a Tuesday evening. I sat in my suite drinking a glass of scotch, watching the camera feed as Julian returned home from work. He looked entirely broken. Since his luxury car had been repossessed, he was forced to take a cheap taxi back to the suburbs. He dragged his feet as he walked up the long driveway, avoiding the puddles of oil left by Richard's vehicle. He walked up the porch steps and stopped dead. Taped to the front door was a massive final notice printed in bold black letters. Julian ripped the envelope open. I turned the audio feed all the way up. Julian stood frozen on the porch reading the document. $15,000 due immediately. Notice of intent to place a lien on the property. Notice of intent to initiate foreclosure. He dropped his briefcase on the wet concrete. He burst through the front door and the shouting began instantly. The audio feed picked up every single desperate word. Julian was screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know why there was a $15,000 fine on his house. He demanded to know why a rusted vehicle was still parked in his driveway. Chloe rushed into the hallway trying to calm him down. She told him to lower his voice and just pay the stupid neighborhood fines out of his savings account. That was the moment Julian completely snapped. He screamed that he had no savings left. He screamed that his bank accounts were entirely empty and he had no idea where the money went. He did not know Chloe had stolen his money to pay off the loan sharks, but he knew he was completely broke. Richard walked out of the ground floor master suite holding a glass of wine. He looked at Julian with pure disgust. Richard told his son-in-law to stop acting like a coward and fight the neighborhood board like a real man. The sheer audacity of Richard telling Julian to be a real man pushed my son over the edge. Julian screamed that he was drowning. He screamed that his car was gone, his money was gone, and now he was about to lose his house because of a stupid barbecue. He pointed a trembling finger at Richard and demanded that the vehicle be removed immediately. Chloe stepped between them, defending her father. She yelled at Julian, calling him pathetic and weak for cracking under pressure. The perfect wealthy family was completely tearing each other apart in the front hallway of a house they did not even own. The walls were closing in and the panic was beautiful to watch. The pressure cooker was finally cracking and they had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. I needed to look my son in the eye one last time. I needed to know if there was even a single shred of the boy I raised left inside that hollow man. I told my lawyer Sterling to leave a breadcrumb. We deliberately forwarded a piece of junk mail from my old address to a cheap motel on the absolute worst edge of the city. But I was not going to let Julian walk into the Waldorf Astoria and see the penthouse. That would completely ruin the grand finale. Instead, I paid $40 in cash for a dingy room that smelled of stale cigarettes and damp carpet. I put on my old faded flannel shirt and my scuffed work boots. I sat on the edge of a sagging mattress and I waited for the rat to take the cheese. It did not take long. Desperation makes a man run very fast. At exactly 3 p.m, a heavy, frantic knock rattled the thin wooden door of the motel room. I walked over and opened it. There stood my 40-year-old son. Julian looked like he had aged 10 years in the span of a single week. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. He had dark circles under his eyes and his hands were trembling uncontrollably. He must have taken a city bus or a cheap cab to get here because his precious luxury car was currently sitting in a bank impound lot. He did not even bother to say hello. He did not ask how his elderly father was surviving in a miserable $40 motel room. He did not ask about the urn containing his mother's ashes. He just pushed past me into the small room, running his hands over his face in pure, unadulterated panic. "Dad, I need your help," he blurted out. His voice was cracking under the heavy weight of his own massive failures. "Everything is falling apart completely. The homeowners association is trying to foreclose on the house. They slapped us with $15,000 in daily fines because Richard parked some rusted, leaking recreational vehicle in the driveway and he absolutely refuses to move it. My car got repossessed in the middle of the night. My bank accounts are completely empty and I do not even know how it happened. Chloe is screaming at me day and night, telling me I am a failure. Dad, I am drowning here. I am going to lose everything. He fell to his knees right there on the dirty motel carpet. The golden boy of this corporate firm begging on a stained floor. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, playing the ultimate victim. I need your retirement savings, Dad, he sobbed. I know you have that emergency fund from your plumbing days. I know you always kept cash stashed away for a rainy day. I just need $20,000 right now to clear the neighborhood fines and get my car out of the lot before I lose my job. I swear to God, I will pay you back. I will pay you back every single penny with interest. Just please do not let me lose my house. I looked down at my only son. 40 years ago, I promised Vivian I would work my fingers to the bone to make sure this boy grew up strong and honorable. I failed. He was a weak coward begging for a financial bailout from the very man he threw out into the freezing rain just days ago. He did not care that I was allegedly living in poverty. He only cared about saving his fake wealthy image and appeasing his toxic wife. But despite my cold, calculating anger, the blood running through my veins is still a father's blood. I had to give him one final test. I had to offer him one absolute chance to save his own soul. I walked over to the cheap laminate desk and picked up my old leather wallet. I pulled out a blank checkbook. Julian stared at it like a starving dog looking at a piece of raw meat. I took a pen from my pocket and held it over the paper. I can give you the money, Julian, I said softly. My voice was completely steady and dead serious. I can write a check right now that will clear every single debt hanging over your head. I can save the house. I can save your job. I can make the immediate pain go away. Julian's eyes lit up with profound, desperate relief. Oh, thank God, he sobbed, reaching out his trembling hand toward the checkbook. Thank you, Dad. I knew you would not abandon me. I knew you would understand. But I pulled the checkbook back just an inch, keeping it out of his reach. I am not abandoning you, I said, looking deep into his eyes. But this money comes with a strict, non-negotiable condition. I will give you the funds to save the house right now if you stand up like a real man. You go back to that house today, you pack Richard's bags, and you throw him out onto the exact same wet grass where you left my belongings. You evict that arrogant parasite. You tell Chloe she will respect the man who put a roof over her head, and you bring me back to my home. You choose your father over a fraud. You establish your boundaries. Do that, and your debts vanish today. The absolute relief on Julian's face evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He slowly pulled his hand back from the desk. He looked at the dirty motel carpet and then up at the stained ceiling, unable to hold my gaze. The silence in the small room was deafening. Dad, I cannot do that, he whispered. His voice was pathetic. It was a weak, trembling sound of a man completely broken by a woman. Chloe will divorce me. She will take everything I have left. She loves her father. He is just going through a rough patch right now. If I kick Richard out, she will leave me, and my life will be entirely over. He wiped his nose on his expensive suit sleeve. He took a deep breath and had the absolute audacity to look at his father and say the most unforgivable words I have ever heard in my 73 years of life. Dad, just bear with it for a little while, he pleaded. I mean, look at this awful place you are in right now. The nursing home Chloe found is really not that bad. It is clean. You will have warm meals and nurses to look after you. You are old, Dad. You do not need a big luxury house anymore. Just give me the money to save my marriage, and you can go to the assisted living facility. It is honestly better for everyone this way. The air in the motel room turned completely to ice. My heart, which had held a microscopic sliver of hope for my son, snapped entirely shut. The test was over. The results were final. He had just looked his father in the eye and actively chosen his own toxic, abusive marriage over my basic human dignity. He thought it was perfectly acceptable to condemn me to a sterile medical facility just so he could keep playing house with a woman who was actively bleeding him dry. He was not a victim of Chloe. He was a willing accomplice to his own destruction. I slowly closed the checkbook. I put the pen back into my pocket. I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not curse him. I walked over to the motel door and pulled it wide open. The The cold afternoon wind blew into the stale room. "Get out," I said. My voice was not that of an old retired plumber. It was the voice of Victor Rollins, a man who destroys corporate enemies without blinking. Julian stared at me, deeply shocked by the sudden shift in my tone. "Dad, please," he begged, getting up from his knees. "The money. You said you would help me. You cannot just leave me to deal with this alone." "You have no father," I said quietly. "You made your choice, Julian. Now you get to live with the absolute consequences of it." I stepped forward, forcing him out onto the concrete walkway outside the room. He stumbled backward, opening his mouth to plead one more time, to offer one more pathetic excuse. But I did not let him speak a single word. I slammed the heavy wooden door directly in his face. I threw the deadbolt, locking it with a loud, definitive click. I stood in the absolute silence of the cheap motel room, knowing that Julian had just taken a pair of scissors and cut his own safety rope. There was no going back now. The demolition of their lives was fully authorized. Desperation is a fascinating thing to observe. It strips away all the fake manners and the polished smiles. It reduces people to their most basic primal instincts. I was sitting in my suite at the Waldorf Astoria, watching the live security feed from the cameras hidden inside the house. The atmosphere in that multi-million-dollar mansion had turned completely toxic. Julian was locking himself in the guest bedroom, refusing to speak to anyone. Richard was pacing the living room, demanding to know how they were going to pay his creditors, and Chloe was cracking under the immense pressure. She was drinking heavy glasses of red wine at 10 in the morning, walking back and forth across the hardwood floors. She needed money. She needed a massive injection of cash to pay off the $15,000 neighborhood fines, to get Julian's car back, and to keep her father's violent bookies away. But her credit cards were declined, her bank accounts were frozen, and her husband was entirely useless. That is when I saw her walk into the home office. When they threw my belongings out into the rain, they kept a few things. They kept my old filing cabinet. Chloe always thought she was a financial genius. She started ripping through the manila folders, tearing out old utility bills and tax documents. She was looking for anything she could liquidate, anything she could use to bail herself out of the disaster she created. Then she stopped. She pulled out a thick blue folder. I knew exactly what was inside that folder. It was an old whole life insurance policy I had purchased 30 years ago. It was a modest policy, just a basic safety net from my plumbing days, but it had accrued roughly $80,000 in cash value over the decades. I kept it in the filing cabinet as a decoy, while my real wealth was locked away in corporate trusts. I watched the security feed as her eyes lit up with pure greed. She was holding a document that clearly stated the policyholder could take out a cash loan against the accumulated value. She thought she had just found a buried treasure. She thought the senile old man she kicked out had completely forgotten about this asset. She sat down at the heavy oak desk and opened her laptop. I watched her type frantically. She was downloading the official loan request forms from the insurance provider website. What she was about to do was not just cruel, it was a major federal crime. But desperation makes arrogant people incredibly stupid. Chloe printed out the loan application. She placed it on the desk right next to an old medical document that had my authentic signature on the bottom. She picked up a blue ink pen. She spent the next 20 minutes practicing my signature on a blank sheet of scratch paper. I watched her trace the curves of my name over and over again, trying to match the slight tremble of an older man's handwriting. When she felt confident enough, she signed the official loan document. She requested a maximum cash payout of $50,000. She filled in the direct deposit banking information. She did not use a joint account. She explicitly wrote down the routing number for a private checking account registered solely in her own name. She scanned the forged document and emailed it directly to the insurance claims department. She leaned back in the expensive leather office chair and took a massive gulp of her wine. She smiled. She honestly believed she had just saved her entire fake aristocratic life. What Chloe did not comprehend was that an $80,000 life insurance policy does not just sit in a vacuum. That policy was professionally managed by the exact same wealth management firm that handled my $40 million corporate portfolio. The insurance company was legally obligated to flag any high-value withdrawal requests and verify them directly with my senior financial advisor. Less than 12 hours later, my encrypted smartphone rang. It was early in the morning, and I was enjoying a plate of fresh fruit overlooking the city skyline. I answered the call. It was David, my senior wealth manager. His voice was incredibly tense. "Vic," he said, speaking very quickly. We have a massive security breach. Someone just submitted an emergency electronic request to borrow $50,000 against your old life insurance policy. The application came through with your signature, but our fraud detection software immediately flagged it. The signature does not match your current biometric profile. And more importantly, the funds were requested to be wired to an external account belonging to a woman named Chloe Rollins. I took a slow bite of my breakfast. "Block the transfer, David," I said calmly. "Lock down the insurance policy and send the entire application file directly to Sterling. I need the IP address, the digital timestamps, and the forged signature document sent to my lawyer immediately." David breathed a heavy sigh of relief, knowing that I was fully aware of the situation. "Consider it done, Vic," he said. "They are incredibly foolish to try this." They left a digital paper trail a mile wide. An hour later, Sterling and I were sitting in a secure conference room at the downtown precinct of the Financial Crimes Division. We were sitting across from Detective Miller, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who had handled corporate embezzlement cases for 20 years. Sterling laid the entire stack of evidence on the metal table. We had the forged application. We had the digital tracking data proving the email originated from the exact IP address of my house. We had the bank records showing the destination account belonged exclusively to Chloe. And we had the high-definition video from my hidden study camera showing her physically practicing and executing the forged signature. Detective Miller looked through the documents and shook his head in absolute disbelief. "This is not just a simple mistake," he said, tapping the glossy photograph of Chloe signing the paper. "This is textbook felony, wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. She forged a financial instrument to steal $50,000 from a senior citizen. In this state, elder financial abuse carries enhanced mandatory sentencing. She is looking at a minimum of 7 to 12 years in a state penitentiary for this stunt alone." Detective Miller closed the folder and stood up. He reached for the heavy police radio clipped to his belt. "I am sending 2 squad cars to that address right now," he said. "We will pull her out of that house in handcuffs before lunchtime. The local prosecutor is going to have a field day with this evidence." I stood up and placed my hand firmly over his radio, stopping him from making the call. My lawyer Sterling watched me closely, knowing exactly how my mind operated. "Do not send the cars, Detective," I said. My voice was low and commanding. Detective Miller looked at me with deep confusion. "Vic, she is actively trying to rob you," he argued. "We have the absolute smoking gun. Why on earth would you want to wait? If we arrest her now, we stop any further damage. Because arresting her on a quiet Wednesday morning in her pajamas is far too easy," I explained. "She humiliated me in front of my own son. She threw the ashes of my dead wife onto the wet grass. She looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless. I do not want her to go quietly into the back of a police cruiser while the neighbors are at work. I want her to feel absolute safety. I want her to think her fraudulent loan was approved. I want her to believe she has won the game. She thrives on attention and social status. She loves to put on a show for the wealthy people she wants to impress." I looked at Sterling and then back to the detective. "I want to build a stage for her," I continued. "I want her to gather every single arrogant person she knows into one room. I want her father Richard to be there bragging about his fake wealth. And when they are at the absolute peak of their arrogance, when they feel completely untouchable, that is when you can put the handcuffs on her." Detective Miller slowly took his hand off the radio. He looked at the undeniable evidence on the table and then looked at the cold determination in my eyes. He nodded slowly, understanding the sheer magnitude of the retribution I was planning. "I can hold the arrest warrant for a few days," Vic the detective said quietly. "But when you give the signal, my officers are coming in through the front door." I smiled a dark, calculated smile. "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Just keep your men ready. The curtain is going to rise very soon, and I promise you it will be the greatest show this city has ever seen. There is a very specific kind of peace that washes over a house when the people inside it believe they have just gotten away with a massive crime. I watched it happen in real time on my security monitors. My financial team had manipulated the automated email system from the insurance company. We sent Chloe a generic message stating her $50,000 loan application was currently under final processing and funds would be dispersed shortly. She did not actually have the money, but the mere promise of it completely changed her posture. She walked through my house with her head held high, acting as if she had just won the lottery. Richard sensed this shift in the atmosphere immediately. He is a predator, and predators know exactly when their host has found a new source of blood. He cornered his daughter in the kitchen that Thursday evening. I turned up the audio on my tablet to listen. Richard poured himself a heavy glass of my most expensive imported wine, a bottle he had shamelessly stolen from my private cellar. He leaned against the marble island and began to spin his web. He told Chloe that they needed to make a statement. He said the neighborhood was starting to whisper about the incident with the recreational vehicle and the massive fines from the homeowners association. He knew that the wealthy residents of this gated community smelled weakness. Richard explained that in high society, the only way to defeat rumors of bankruptcy is to project overwhelming absolute wealth. He proposed a housewarming party, a grand, luxurious welcoming gala to officially introduce him as the new patriarch of the estate. But I knew his real motivation. Richard was not just throwing a party to save face with the snooty neighbors. His private investigator file was sitting right next to me on my desk. Richard was completely broke, and his old country club friends had stopped taking his phone calls weeks ago. He needed fresh capital for his fraudulent investment schemes. If he could lure those wealthy, arrogant men into a multi-million-dollar mansion and convince them that his family owned it, he could trick them into opening their wallets. It was a classic confidence scam. You have to look rich to steal from the rich. Chloe absolutely loved the idea. She was completely intoxicated by the delusion of her own grandeur. She told her father they would host the most lavish event the neighborhood had ever seen. When Julian came home from work later that night, he looked terrified. He saw the catering brochures scattered across the dining table. He asked his wife how on earth they could afford to host a massive party when they were facing foreclosure, and his luxury car was sitting in an impound lot. Chloe laughed right in his face. She told him not to worry his pretty little head about the finances. She said she had secured a private loan from a wealthy contact and that all their problems were completely solved. She did not tell her husband that she had committed felony identity theft. Julian, being the absolute coward that he is, simply nodded and walked away. He was so desperate to maintain his fake life that he did not even question where a sudden $50,000 lifeline came from. He just accepted the lie because the truth was too heavy for his weak shoulders to carry. The preparations for the party were absolutely sickening to watch. They were spending ghost money. Money they believed was arriving any second but was actually sitting safely in my frozen corporate accounts. Chloe hired a premium catering service that charged $200 a plate. She ordered silver platters of caviar, imported champagne, and an entire station dedicated to prime rib. She hired a professional valet company to park the cars because she did not want her wealthy guests walking up the driveway. She even hired a live string quartet to play classical music in the grand foyer. They were actively transforming the home my late wife and I built into a theatrical stage for their ultimate deception. Richard took charge of the guest list. He personally drove around the gated community handing out heavy embossed invitations to the doctors, lawyers, and executives who lived on our street. He even drove to the exclusive country club, the very same club that had revoked his membership for unpaid dues and invited the most arrogant, wealthy men he could find. He told everyone that his successful daughter had just acquired a prime piece of real estate, and he was moving in to oversee the grand renovations. He was selling them a total fantasy, and they were eagerly buying tickets to the show. As I sat in my penthouse suite watching the caterers set up pristine white tents on my back lawn, I felt a deep, profound sense of poetic justice. They were doing all the heavy lifting for me. They were building the exact stage I needed. They were gathering the precise audience I wanted. The snooty neighbors who had looked down on me for driving a rusted old Chevy truck would all be there. The wealthy investors Richard desperately wanted to scam would all be there. Everyone who thought they were better than a retired black plumber was going to have a front row seat to the greatest financial execution this city had ever witnessed. Saturday evening finally arrived. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the expensive neighborhood. My house looked absolutely immaculate. I watched the live feed as Chloe walked down the grand staircase wearing a designer silk gown that she had undoubtedly purchased on a high-interest credit card. Richard was wearing a sharply tailored tuxedo, acting like he was old money royalty. Julian was hovering nervously in the background, holding a glass of expensive scotch, trying his hardest to look like the successful master of the house. The luxury cars began to pull into my driveway shortly after 7 o'clock. The valet drivers in crisp white shirts rushed to open the doors of shiny Porsches, Range Rovers, and Mercedes-Benz sedans. The men wore tailored suits and the women wore diamonds that sparkled under the porch lights. They walked through my front doors handing expensive bottles of wine to Chloe, who accepted them with a fake gracious smile. The string quartet played a soft, elegant melody that echoed through the high ceilings of the foyer. The stage was perfectly, completely set. The champagne was flowing freely. I watched Richard working the crowded room. He was holding court near the fireplace, shaking hands and patting men on the back. I could see him leaning in close, whispering his fraudulent investment pitches into the ears of greedy men who believed they were standing in the home of a billionaire. Chloe was standing in the kitchen, boasting to a group of neighborhood wives about her grand vision for completely gutting and redesigning my old bedroom. She spoke about me as if I was a distant, unfortunate memory. An old man they had mercifully placed into a cheap home so they could finally elevate the property to its true potential. They felt entirely untouchable. They stood in the center of my home, drinking my wine, spending stolen money, and believing they had conquered the world. The absolute peak of their arrogance had been reached. I closed my laptop and turned off the security monitor. It was time to stop watching the screen. It was time to join the party. I picked up my phone and called Sterling. I told my lawyer to grab the folders, the legal notices, and the arrest warrants. I walked over to the closet and pulled out the bespoke $10,000 charcoal suit I had specifically tailored for this exact occasion. It was time to shed the faded flannel shirt for good. It was time to show my daughter-in-law, her arrogant father, and my cowardly son exactly who they had messed with. I turned away from the glowing security monitors displaying the lavish party happening in my home. The visual of Richard sipping my most expensive imported wine and Chloe parading around the grand foyer in a designer dress bought with stolen funds was starting to make my blood boil. But anger is for amateurs and desperate people. Professionals prefer absolute precision and cold calculation. I walked over to the wet bar in the corner of the presidential suite and poured 2 glasses of sparkling water. The quiet luxury of the penthouse was a sharp contrast to the obnoxious noise of the housewarming gala my daughter-in-law was currently hosting. They were celebrating a victory they had not earned using money they did not own. A heavy rhythmic knock echoed through the quiet room. The thick oak door swung open and Sterling Pierce walked in. My lawyer did not look like a man who was working late on a Saturday night. He looked like an executioner arriving at the gallows. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and carried a thick black leather briefcase. He did not say a word as he walked across the plush carpet. He placed the heavy briefcase on the glass coffee table and popped the golden clasps. The metallic sound was as sharp as a gunshot in the silent room. Sterling pulled out the first stack of thick legal paper. It was printed on heavy watermarked stock. He slid it across the glass toward me. I looked down at the documents. The bold black letters at the top read, "Immediate order of property repossession and trust revocation." I read through the clauses my lawyer had drafted so carefully. The document outlined every single violation Julian and Chloe had committed against the strict conditions of the Rollins Family Revocable Living Trust. It detailed the unlawful eviction of the primary grantor, which was me. It detailed the unauthorized occupation by Richard, a man who had no legal standing to even step foot on the driveway. It detailed the unpaid homeowners association fines and the subsequent financial negligence that threatened the estate. But the most beautiful part of the entire document was located on the very last page. There at the bottom right corner was the heavy blue ink signature of a county superior court judge. It was an emergency injunction. It granted my corporate security team the absolute legal authority to enter the premises and forcefully remove all unauthorized occupants immediately. There was no 30-day eviction notice. There was no grace period to pack their bags. There was no lengthy appeals process. Julian had broken a highly specific conditional trust, and the judge had legally stripped him of his home with a single stroke of a pen. The house belonged entirely to the corporate entity now. Sterling did not stop there. He reached back into the leather briefcase and pulled out a second manila folder. This one was marked with the official seal of the local police department Financial Crimes Division. Detective Miller kept his promise, Sterling said quietly. He took the security footage, the forged loan application, and the bank routing numbers directly to the district attorney on Friday afternoon. The prosecutor took one look at the sheer volume of undeniable evidence and pushed it straight to a grand jury judge for an emergency review. Sterling slid the second piece of paper across the table. It was a formal arrest warrant for Chloe. The charges listed were absolutely devastating: felony wire fraud, felony identity theft, grand larceny, trafficking of stolen goods across state lines for selling my antique tools to our undercover broker. There was no bail amount listed on the preliminary warrant. She was going to be taken directly from her extravagant party to the county jail and processed like a common criminal. The trap was completely closed. There were absolutely no loopholes left for them to crawl through. They were backed into a concrete corner of their own making, and the walls were about to crush them. I tapped the arrest warrant with my index finger, feeling the heavy weight of the paper. "It is time," I told Sterling. My lawyer nodded and stepped out into the hallway to make the final phone calls to the police dispatch and my private security team. Everything had to be timed to the exact second. I walked into the massive master bedroom of the penthouse suite. Laid out perfectly on the king-sized bed was the final piece of my preparation. For 10 years, I had played the role of the humble retired plumber. I wore faded flannel shirts that smelled of sawdust. I wore scuffed work boots with dirt permanently caked into the heels. I drove a rusted truck and kept my head down, letting the world overlook me. I did it because Vivian always said that a man should be judged by his character and his actions, not by the fabric on his back or the logo on his vehicle. I wanted Julian to learn that lesson. I wanted him to value hard work over cheap appearances. But he refused. He chose the shallow illusion of wealth over the deep roots of loyalty. He chose an arrogant wife and a fraudulent father-in-law over the man who gave him life. So I was going to show him exactly what real, unforgiving wealth looked like. I took off the old flannel shirt and tossed it into the trash can without a second thought. I picked up the crisp white dress shirt made of imported Italian cotton and buttoned it up. The fabric was cool and sharp against my skin. I slipped on the custom-tailored trousers, feeling the perfect break over my ankles. Then I lifted the jacket. It was a bespoke $10,000 charcoal gray suit tailored specifically to my exact measurements by the finest craftsmen in the city. The fabric felt like absolute armor. It was the uniform of a man who commanded boardrooms and dictated the skyline of the city. I put on a pair of polished black leather Oxfords that cost more than Julian's first car. I walked over to the dresser and picked up a heavy, solid gold watch, strapping it securely around my wrist. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling mirror and looked at my reflection. The tired, fragile old man who had been kicked out into the freezing rain was completely gone. Staring back at me was the apex predator of the real estate market. The lion of the business world had finally returned to claim his territory. My posture was straight, my shoulders were broad, my eyes held no mercy. I looked at the mahogany urn resting on the marble side table. "Watch this, Vivian," I whispered to my late wife. "I am going to clean up our house." I walked back into the living room where Sterling was waiting by the door. My lawyer took one look at my charcoal suit and smiled a very dangerous, knowing smile. He knew the man standing before him was the same man who had ruthlessly built an empire from the ground up. "The police are staging 2 blocks away from the neighborhood," Sterling said, putting his phone into his pocket. "The corporate security team is waiting at the front gate in unmarked vehicles. We are completely ready to move whenever you give the signal. Let us go," I said softly. I walked out of the presidential suite and headed for the private elevator. The doors slid open and we descended to the main lobby in total silence. The hotel clerk who had tried to kick me out days earlier was standing behind the front desk. He saw me stride across the marble floor in my bespoke suit, and he immediately stood at rigid attention, lowering his head in profound respect. I did not even look in his direction. I walked through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool night air. A massive, sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom was waiting at the curb with the engine purring silently. A professional driver in a dark suit opened the rear door for me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat and Sterling got in beside me. The door closed, shutting out the noise of the city street. The driver looked at me through the rear-view mirror, waiting for his instructions. "Take us to the suburbs," I told the driver. "It is time to crash a party." The neighborhood of Oak Creek Estates had never seen a spectacle quite like this. The sprawling front lawn of my property was illuminated by dozens of ambient landscape lights. A massive white tent stood in the backyard, casting a warm golden glow into the cool night air. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. I watched the scene unfold from the tinted windows of the Rolls-Royce Phantom as we idled half a block away. Valets in crisp white uniforms were jogging back and forth, parking the leased Mercedes and BMW sedans of the neighborhood elite. I could hear the faint sound of a live string quartet drifting through the open front doors. Chloe had spared absolutely no expense. She had hired premium caterers who were currently circulating the grand foyer with silver trays of caviar and imported champagne. She was spending $50,000 of phantom money to impress people who would not even look at her if she were broken down on the side of the highway. I watched her through the large bay windows. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green designer gown, laughing a high-pitched fake laugh and clutching a crystal flute. Julian was standing next to her looking incredibly stiff in his tuxedo. His eyes darted around the room nervously. He knew the absolute terror of his financial reality, but he was trying desperately to play the part of the successful host. He was a hollow man propping up a hollow life, pretending everything was perfect while the ground crumbled beneath his expensive shoes. But the true star of this pathetic theater was Richard. Chloe's father had positioned himself right in the center of my formal living room, holding court like a king. He was surrounded by a circle of older, wealthy white men. These were the managing partners, the senior surgeons, and the aggressive corporate lawyers of the gated community. The very same men who used to give me polite, condescending nods when they saw me pulling weeds in my faded overalls. Richard was drinking a glass of my rarest 20-year-old scotch, a bottle he had shamelessly raided from my locked cellar. He took a slow, arrogant sip and smiled at his captive audience. I rolled down the heavy window of the Rolls-Royce just a crack. The night was quiet enough that the voices from the open living room drifted perfectly down to the street. Richard was talking loudly, making sure his voice carried over the classical music. He was telling them about the house. He told the men that when he first arrived, the place was an absolute disaster. He said it was filled with rusted junk and old, useless furniture belonging to a freeloader. He actually laughed as he described how he had to do a massive clean sweep. He boasted that he completely cleared out the dead weight and threw out the garbage to finally bring the property up to its true potential. He was talking about my clothes. He was talking about the mahogany urn holding my dead wife. He called the memories of my entire life garbage just to get a cheap laugh from men he wanted to scam. The men in the circle chuckled, taking sips of their expensive drinks, completely unaware that they were laughing at the real owner of the house. Then Richard pivoted seamlessly into his true agenda. Having established his fake dominance, he started talking about commercial real estate investments. He lowered his voice slightly, acting as if he was letting them in on a highly exclusive secret. He talked about a multi-million-dollar commercial development project downtown. He hinted that he was opening up a few early investment slots for close friends. It was a complete scam. A desperate final play from a bankrupt man trying to steal from his wealthy neighbors to pay off his violent bookies. And these arrogant men, blinded by the illusion of Richard's grand housewarming gala, were leaning in, hanging onto his every word. The peak of his absolute arrogance had been achieved. He felt entirely untouchable. I turned to Sterling, who was sitting quietly in the plush leather seat beside me, holding the heavy black briefcase on his lap. "It is time," I told my lawyer quietly. "Give the driver the signal." Sterling tapped the glass partition and nodded to the driver. The massive engine of the Rolls-Royce Phantom purred to life. The heavy black vehicle glided smoothly down the manicured street, moving like a shark through dark water. We did not pull up to the curb. We turned directly into the center of the driveway, blocking the path of the busy valet drivers. The sheer size and absolute luxury of the Phantom immediately commanded the attention of everyone outside. The young valet supervisor jogged up to the vehicle looking slightly panicked. He had been parking leased entry-level luxury cars all night. He knew a $500,000 custom vehicle when he saw one. He reached for the heavy silver door handle, but my driver was already stepping out. My driver walked around the back of the vehicle and pulled open my door. I stepped out into the cool night air. I did not look like the frail, hunched-over plumber they had kicked out into the rain just a week ago. I was wearing my bespoke charcoal gray suit tailored flawlessly to my broad shoulders. The heavy Italian fabric absorbed the ambient light. My posture was completely straight, my chin held high. The solid gold watch on my wrist caught the illumination from the porch. Sterling stepped out right behind me, looking like an absolute corporate executioner in his sharp navy suit, grasping the briefcase tight. The sudden arrival of the Phantom caused a ripple effect that spread rapidly from the driveway to the front porch. The guests who were standing outside smoking premium cigars and holding crystal glasses stopped talking. They stared at me, trying to process the visual shock. A few of the neighborhood executives recognized me immediately, not as the old man who fixed the sprinklers, but as Victor Rollins, the commercial developer whose name was plastered across the downtown skyline. A heavy, stunned silence began to spread through the front lawn like a virus. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clinking of glasses ceased entirely. I ignored all of them. I did not offer a single smile or a polite nod. I walked up the wide concrete driveway with slow, deliberate steps. My polished leather Oxfords clicked sharply against the pavement. Sterling walked perfectly in step beside me, holding the briefcase that contained their total destruction. I reached the bottom of the porch stairs. The front doors were wide open, revealing the crowded grand foyer. I could see Chloe standing near the staircase, laughing loudly, completely oblivious to the storm that had just arrived on her doorstep. I could see Richard still holding his glass of my stolen scotch deep into his fraudulent pitch. The string quartet was playing a lively, elegant tune, completely unaware that the curtain was about to fall on this pathetic masquerade. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, letting the absolute power of the moment settle into my bones. I thought about Vivian and the promise I made to protect this family. I realized that excising a tumor is the only way to save the body. I walked up the steps, crossed the threshold, and stepped directly into the center of my own house. The execution was officially underway. I stepped across the threshold of my own home, and the heavy oak front doors closed behind me, shutting out the cool night air. The grand foyer was packed with the local elite holding crystal champagne flutes and laughing at jokes they did not actually find funny. The live string quartet was playing a fast classical piece in the corner, filling the high ceilings with elegant music. The entire house smelled of expensive catered food and imported floral arrangements. I walked across the imported marble floor with Sterling right beside me. My polished leather Oxfords made a sharp, commanding sound that seemed to cut right through the classical music and the wealthy chatter. Chloe was standing near the base of the sweeping staircase. She was in the middle of telling an animated story to a group of neighborhood wives, holding her glass of expensive champagne delicately by the stem. She turned her head casually and saw me. For a split second, her brain simply could not process what she was looking at. She was used to seeing me in faded flannel shirts and dirt-covered work boots. Seeing me in a $10,000 bespoke charcoal suit with a posture as straight as forged steel completely short-circuited her mind. But then the recognition hit her, and her face drained of absolutely all color. She dropped her fake socialite smile instantly. She excused herself from the wealthy wives and marched toward me, her emerald green designer dress dragging heavily across the floor. She stopped a few feet away from me. She demanded to know what I was doing here. She kept her voice low, trying her absolute hardest not to cause a scene, but her eyes were wild with pure, unadulterated panic. She hissed at me to get out immediately before she called the private security to drag me off the property. She actually called me a homeless trespasser in my own house. She said I was going to ruin the aesthetic of her perfect night. Richard noticed the sudden tension and walked over, leaving his circle of wealthy targets by the fireplace. He puffed out his chest, trying to look like the dominant alpha male of the estate. He looked me up and down, taking in my tailored Italian suit and the solid gold watch shining on my wrist. He let out a loud, condescending little laugh that reeked of fake superiority. He told me that renting a nice suit for the night did not change the fact that I was just a retired plumber who did not belong in this premium zip code. He told me to turn around and walk back out into the street before he had me arrested for trespassing and harassment. He was so incredibly arrogant, so completely blind to the reality standing right in front of his face. Julian was hovering a few feet behind them, sweating profusely, clutching a glass of scotch and looking down at the floor, too much of a coward to say a single word to his own father. I did not answer Chloe. I did not look at Richard. I treated them exactly like what they were to me in that specific moment, which was absolutely nothing. I did not give them the dignity of a response or the satisfaction of an argument. I simply walked right past them. I brushed past Richard's shoulder with the cold indifference of a man walking past a discarded piece of trash on the sidewalk. Chloe gasped in pure outrage. She yelled for the valet security guards to come inside, but nobody moved. I walked directly toward the center of the massive living room, where the most powerful men in the neighborhood were standing. These were the hospital directors, the hedge fund managers, and the senior investment bankers that Richard was desperately trying to scam with his fraudulent investment pitches. As I approached the circle, the men slowly stopped talking. A senior managing partner from the biggest commercial law firm in the city turned around. He held a heavy glass of expensive bourbon in his hand. He took one single look at me, and his eyes went wide with absolute profound shock. He nearly dropped his drink onto the expensive Persian rug. He immediately stood up completely straight and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of pure submission. "Good evening, Mr. Rollins," he said, his voice trembling with profound respect. "It is an absolute honor to see you, sir." The other wealthy men in the circle quickly turned around. When they realized exactly who was standing in front of them, the entire group reacted as if untouchable royalty had just entered the room. They quickly put down their drinks on the passing silver trays. They stepped forward, extending their hands, eagerly competing for my attention. "Good evening, Mr. Rollins. Thank you so much for having us, Mr. Rollins. We had no idea you were attending tonight, sir. It is a privilege to be in your home, Mr. Rollins." The name Rollins meant billions in this city. I owned the commercial skyscrapers these men worked in. I owned the development firm that built the country club they played golf at. In their world, I was a living god. The string quartet slowly stopped playing. The chatter in the grand foyer died down until the entire room went completely dead silent. Every single guest in the house was staring at the center of the living room, watching the most powerful white men in the gated community bow their heads and eagerly shake the hand of a 73-year-old black man. I turned my head slowly and looked back at the sweeping staircase. Chloe and Richard stood entirely frozen. I watched their faces completely shatter into a million pieces. The sheer absolute horror blooming in their eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Richard was staring at the exact men he had been desperately trying to impress all night long. The men who had looked at him with mild amusement and polite tolerance were now bowing their heads in deep submission to the very man he had thrown out into the freezing rain. The illusion of his aristocratic superiority was violently ripped away in a matter of seconds. He suddenly realized he had just insulted and mocked the apex predator of the entire local economy. His face turned a sickly shade of gray and his mouth hung open in silent terror. Chloe was literally shaking. She gripped the wooden banister of the staircase so hard her knuckles turned completely white. She was unable to process the reality that was violently collapsing around her. Her father-in-law, the man she thought was a pathetic charity case, the man whose vintage tools she had stolen and sold for pennies, was the undisputed master of their entire universe. The man she had just called a homeless trespasser owned the men she was trying to impress. I looked her dead in the eye across the silent, crowded room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just stared at her with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who was about to take absolutely everything she had ever cared about. The panic in her chest was so visible she looked like she was about to collapse right there on the marble floor. Sterling stepped up beside me, opening the golden clasps of his heavy black leather briefcase. The metallic click echoed through the silent house like the cocking of a loaded weapon. The social execution was over. It was time for the legal execution to begin. The silence in the grand living room was absolutely suffocating, the kind of silence that happens right before a massive structure collapses into dust. Every single pair of eyes in that house was locked onto me. The wealthy executives, the surgeons, the country club elite, they all stood completely frozen, holding their expensive drinks. I turned my attention away from the terrified faces of my son and my daughter-in-law. I focused my gaze entirely on Richard. Richard was standing near the grand marble fireplace. A minute ago, he was holding court, acting like the undisputed king of a multi-million-dollar estate. Now he looked like a cornered rat trapped in a room full of apex predators. His pastel polo shirt and his tailored tuxedo jacket suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. The smug, aristocratic smirk had completely melted off his face, leaving behind a pale, sweating mask of pure dread. He tried to straighten his posture. He tried to maintain the illusion, but his hands were shaking so violently that the ice in his stolen Scotch glass rattled against the crystal. I held out my hand. "Sterling." My lawyer reached into his heavy black leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. He placed it firmly into my palm. The folder contained every single pathetic secret Richard had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to hide. I held the folder up so the entire room could see it. I did not need to shout. When a man like me speaks in a room like this, people hold their breath to listen. Richard the First said. My voice was deep and resonant, echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. It carried the absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground we were all standing on. I see you have been entertaining my guests. I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. I heard you pitching a highly exclusive commercial real estate investment to the managing partners standing right next to you. You were talking about prime downtown development. You were talking about early buy and opportunities for your closest friends. Richard swallowed hard. The prominent Adam apple in his throat bobbed up and down. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some charming excuse to play it off as a joke, but his vocal cords completely failed him. No sound came out. I opened the red folder. I looked at the top sheet of paper, and then I looked at the circle of wealthy men who had been listening to him. Before any of you gentlemen open your checkbooks, I said, projecting my voice clearly, I think you should know exactly who you are dealing with. The man standing before you is not a real estate mogul. He is not a retired Wall Street titan. He is an absolute, complete, and total fraud. The gasps rippled through the crowd of wealthy neighbors. The wives covered their mouths in shock. The men tightened their grips on their glasses. I turned my eyes back to Richard. He took a tiny, pathetic step backward, hitting the edge of the marble fireplace. You stand in my house, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, chilling frequency. You drink my 20-year-old scotch. You throw a lavish party using money stolen from my life insurance policy. And you boast to these successful men about your massive investments. But why do you not tell them the truth? Why do you not tell your country club friends that your membership was permanently revoked 6 months ago for unpaid dues? A murmur of disgust swept through the circle of executives. In their world, failing to pay club dues was the ultimate sign of financial decay. Why do you not tell them about the luxury apartment down in the city? I continued, stepping even closer. The apartment you told my son you were having minor lease issues with. Why do you not tell everyone in this room that you did not choose to leave that apartment? You were forcefully evicted by the county sheriff's department because you have not paid rent in nearly a year. You are completely homeless, Richard. You are an uninvited squatter hiding in a house that I own. Richard started to hyperventilate. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. He looked around the room, desperately searching for a friendly face, searching for an ally. But the men he had been trying to impress were now staring at him with absolute, profound revulsion. Wealthy people despise nothing more than a parasite pretending to be one of them. But I was not done. I was not even close to being done. I pulled the second document from the red folder. I held it up for the room to see. Let us talk about your investments, Richard, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension like a surgical blade. Let us talk about the $1.5 million you currently owe. And we are not talking about bank loans or corporate debt. You owe $1.5 million to illegal offshore bookies and violent underground lenders to feed a degenerate gambling addiction. The entire living room erupted in shocked whispers. Men began to physically step away from Richard. They did not want to be anywhere near a man tied to violent criminals. They realized they had been sharing drinks and laughing with a desperate con artist who was trying to use their money to save his own broken legs. Richard finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic squeak. That is a lie, he stammered, looking around wildly. He is lying. He is just a crazy old man trying to ruin my family. Do not listen to him. I did not even blink. I pulled out the final stack of papers from the folder. They were bank statements highlighted in bright yellow marker. If I am lying, Richard, I challenged him, then perhaps you can explain these bank transfers. I turned my body slightly so I was addressing not just Richard, but my son Julian, who was standing frozen near the staircase. Julian was sweating profusely, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the destruction happening in his living room. Julian, I called out. My son flinched as if I had physically struck him. Did you know that for the past 3 weeks your loving wife has been completely draining your joint savings accounts? Did you know that the money you thought was going toward your car payments and your mortgage was actually being wired to offshore holding companies? Julian's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. He looked at Chloe, who was violently shaking her head, crying silent, panicked tears. It is true, Julian, I said, slamming the undeniable truth into his chest. Your wife has been stealing your hard-earned money, your entire financial future, to pay off her father's illegal gambling debts. That is why your car was repossessed in the middle of the night. That is why you are completely broke. You let this man sleep under your roof, and he repaid you by letting his daughter bleed you entirely dry. Julian dropped his glass of scotch. It shattered against the hardwood floor, but nobody even jumped. The sound of breaking glass was nothing compared to the sound of Julian's reality completely shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He grabbed his hair with both hands, letting out a low, guttural sound of pure agony. He looked at Chloe with an expression of absolute disgust and betrayal. He finally realized that the woman he chose over his own father was the very person bankrupting him. I turned back to Richard. The destruction of his aristocratic mask was beautifully complete. He was no longer a proud, wealthy investor. He was a pathetic, exposed beggar standing in the middle of a room full of people who now looked at him like he was a diseased animal. The physical reaction of the crowd was incredible to watch. The senior surgeons, the corporate lawyers, the hedge fund managers, the very men Richard desperately needed to validate his existence, slowly turned their backs on him. They took several large steps away, creating a wide, empty circle of isolation around him. They looked at his pastel polo shirt and his leased tuxedo with sheer, unadulterated contempt. He was infected, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with him. "Get out of my house, Richard," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried the weight of an absolute, undeniable command. "You are a fraud, you are a thief, and you are officially out of time." Richard stood completely alone in the center of the Persian rug. He looked at the faces of the disgusted neighbors. He looked at his weeping daughter. He looked at the shattered, broken man who was his son-in-law. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide. His fake world was dead, and I was the one who pulled the trigger. I stepped across the threshold of my own home, and the heavy oak front doors closed behind me, shutting out the cool night air. The grand foyer was packed with the local elite holding crystal champagne flutes and laughing at jokes they did not actually find funny. The live string quartet was playing a fast classical piece in the corner, filling the high ceilings with elegant music. The entire house smelled of expensive catered food and imported floral arrangements. I walked across the imported marble floor with Sterling right beside me. My polished leather Oxfords made a sharp, commanding sound that seemed to cut right through the classical music and the wealthy chatter. Chloe was standing near the base of the sweeping staircase. She was in the middle of telling an animated story to a group of neighborhood wives, holding her glass of expensive champagne delicately by the stem. She turned her head casually and saw me. For a split second, her brain simply could not process what she was looking at. She was used to seeing me in faded flannel shirts and dirt-covered work boots. Seeing me in a $10,000 bespoke charcoal suit with a posture as straight as forged steel, completely short, circuited her mind. But then the recognition hit her, and her face drained of absolutely all color. She dropped her fake socialite smile instantly. She excused herself from the wealthy wives and marched toward me, her emerald green designer dress dragging heavily across the floor. She stopped a few feet away from me. She demanded to know what I was doing here. She kept her voice low, trying her absolute hardest not to cause a scene, but her eyes were wild with pure, unadulterated panic. She hissed at me to get out immediately before she called the private security to drag me off the property. She actually called me a homeless trespasser in my own house. She said I was going to ruin the aesthetic of her perfect night. The destruction of Richard left a heavy, suffocating silence in the room. The wealthy guests were staring at the floor, unable to look at the pathetic man standing by the fireplace. Julian was still clutching his head, lost in the realization that his wife had bankrupted him. But Chloe was a different breed of toxic. While her husband crumbled and her father withered, her sheer, arrogant entitlement violently kicked in. She could not process defeat. Her narcissistic brain simply rejected the reality of what was happening. Her face turned bright red, contrasting violently with her emerald green designer dress. She stomped across the marble floor, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "Get out!" she screamed. Her high-pitched voice shattered the quiet tension in the grand foyer. "I do not care who you think you are or what lies you are spreading about my family. You are a bitter, jealous old man trying to ruin my life. This is my house. Do you hear me? This is my home. I am the lady of this house, and you are nothing but a trespasser. I want you out of my house right this second, or I swear to God I will have the security guards drag you out by your cheap collar." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. I just stood there looking at her with absolute profound pity. It is truly a remarkable thing to watch an arrogant person stand on the deck of a sinking ship and demand that the ocean apologize to them. She was screaming about property rights while wearing a dress bought with stolen money, standing in a room paid for by the man she was currently threatening. "You are very brave with things you do not own, Chloe," I said softly. "I own everything here," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Julian bought this house. We are on the deed. You are just a pathetic squatter we allowed to live in the basement out of the goodness of our hearts. Now get out." I slowly shook my head. I took one step back and turned slightly to my right. I looked at the man standing beside me in the sharp navy suit. "Sterling," I said calmly, "I believe my daughter-in-law requires a brief education in commercial property law. Would you be so kind as to explain her current living situation?" Sterling Pierce stepped forward. He did not look like a man you wanted to argue with. He possessed the cold, clinical authority of a corporate executioner. He opened his heavy black leather briefcase right there on the catered dining table, pushing aside a silver platter of expensive hors d'oeuvres. He pulled out the thick stack of watermarked legal documents, the papers that contained the absolute destruction of Chloe's entire fake aristocratic world. "Good evening, everyone," Sterling said, projecting his deep voice so that every single wealthy neighbor and frightened caterer in the room could hear him perfectly. "My name is Sterling Pierce. I am the senior legal counsel for Rollins Development and the primary executor of the Rollins Family Revocable Living Trust." He turned his cold gaze directly onto Chloe, who was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with rage. You just made several aggressive claims regarding the legal ownership of this property." Sterling began holding up the first document. "You stated that your husband Julian purchased this home. You stated that your name is on the deed. I am afraid you are operating under a massive, profound delusion." Julian looked up from the floor, his face completely pale. Chloe crossed her arms defensively, but I could see her hands shaking. "What are you talking about?" she spat. "We pay the property taxes. We pay the homeowners association." "No," Sterling corrected her sharply. "You do not. For the past 5 years, Victor Rollins has been handing your husband $500 in cash every single month. You called it his pathetic allowance. In reality, that exact amount was automatically routed through your husband's account to cover the exact cost of the property taxes and the neighborhood fees. You have never paid a single dime toward the actual ownership of this estate." Sterling held up the heavy document displaying the official county seals. "This house was purchased 7 years ago for $2.4 million in cash," Sterling announced to the silent room. "It was purchased by a commercial holding company and placed immediately into a blind trust. Your husband Julian is not the homeowner. He has never been the homeowner. He is listed solely as a conditional beneficiary resident. Your name, Chloe, is absolutely nowhere on any legal document tied to this property. You do not own the walls. You do not own the floors. You do not even own the grass outside." Chloe's jaw literally dropped. The arrogant fire in her eyes was suddenly extinguished by a wave of freezing cold panic. She looked at Julian, demanding that he deny it, demanding that he tell her the lawyer was lying. But Julian just stared at the floor, tears welling in his eyes. He knew. Deep down, he always knew he was just playing a role his father had funded. But conditional residency comes with strict legal covenants. Sterling continued, his voice rising with absolute authority. Clause 4, Section B of the trust agreement clearly states that Julian Rollins is permitted to reside in this property completely rent-free under one specific non-negotiable condition. He must provide adequate shelter, care, and residence for the primary grantor of the trust. The primary grantor is Victor Rollins. The wealthy guests in the room began to murmur. They were business owners and corporate executives. They understood exactly what a conditional trust meant, and they understood exactly where this was going. "Last Tuesday," Sterling said, pacing slowly in front of the terrified couple, "you violently broke that covenant. You placed 30 years of Mr. Rollins' personal belongings into cheap black garbage bags and threw them out into the freezing rain. You took the urn containing the ashes of his late wife and left it in a soggy cardboard box. You looked the legal owner of this property in the eye and you told him he was evicted so that your bankrupt father could take his bedroom." Chloe staggered backward. She bumped into the marble staircase, completely unable to support her own weight. The realization of what she had done was finally crashing down on her. By forcefully removing the primary grantor from the premises, Sterling declared, his voice booming with finality, "You instantly and permanently voided the trust agreement. You breached the singular condition of your residency." Sterling pulled the final page from the stack and held it high in the air. "This is an immediate order of property repossession signed this very afternoon by a superior court judge," Sterling announced. "The trust is officially dissolved. this property has immediately reverted to the full corporate ownership of Rollins Development. As of this exact second, Julian, you and your wife and your father are legally classified as unauthorized squatters trespassing on private corporate property. The payoff was absolutely magnificent. The sheer total devastation on Chloe's face was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Her entire fake life, her grand housewarming party, her emerald green dress, her arrogant boasts to the neighborhood wives, it all collapsed into a pile of worthless rubble. She was not the lady of the manor. She was a homeless trespasser standing in a house she had stolen from the man who actually owned it. "You cannot do this," Chloe whispered, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "Where are we supposed to go? We live here. You cannot just take our house away in the middle of the night." "It is not your house, Chloe," I said, stepping forward and looking down at her. "It never was. You wanted a luxury lifestyle, but you did not want to earn it. You wanted the grand estate, but you treated the man who provided it like garbage. You thought you could throw me out into the rain and steal my sanctuary. Well, I am taking my sanctuary back." The wealthy guests who had been drinking my champagne and eating my catered food quickly realized they were standing in the middle of a repossessed crime scene. The senior surgeons and the hedge fund managers began setting their crystal glasses down on the tables. They quietly signaled their wives and started moving swiftly toward the front doors. Nobody wanted to be associated with a family of fraudulent squatters. They avoided making eye contact with Richard, who was still cowering by the fireplace. They walked right past Chloe, who was sliding down the wooden banisters, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The grand housewarming gala was officially over. The guests were fleeing the sinking ship. But the absolute best part of the night was still waiting outside, because taking their house, taking their pride, and taking their social standing was only the civil penalty. I looked at Sterling and nodded. My lawyer reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He sent a single text message. 10 seconds later, the peaceful silence of the upscale suburban street was shattered by the loud wailing of approaching sirens. Red and blue lights began flashing rapidly, illuminating the large bay windows of the grand foyer. The criminal penalty had finally arrived. The piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet elegance of the upscale neighborhood. Through the massive bay windows of the grand foyer, the harsh flashing of red and blue emergency lights painted the walls in violent sweeping strokes. The remaining wealthy guests, who had been lingering in the corners hoping to quietly observe the drama, suddenly realized that the situation had escalated from a high society scandal to an active crime scene. The caterers abandoned their silver trays of expensive appetizers on the dining tables. The string quartet had already packed their instruments and fled out the side doors. Panic, a very specific kind of upper-class panic, completely took over the room. The men and women who had spent the evening drinking my stolen champagne shoved past each other in a desperate rush to get out the front doors before their reputations were stained by proximity to an arrest. I stood in the center of the marble floor, perfectly still in my bespoke charcoal suit. Sterling stood right beside me, holding his leather briefcase like a shield of absolute authority. We watched as the heavy wooden doors swung wide open. Detective Miller stepped across the threshold. He was a seasoned investigator who had zero patience for wealthy criminals playing the victim. He was followed by 4 uniformed police officers, their duty belts clinking sharply in the suddenly empty foyer. They did not wipe their boots. They did not care about the pristine imported rugs or the expensive floral arrangements. They moved with absolute tactical precision, spreading out to secure the immediate area. Chloe was standing near the base of the sweeping staircase. Her emerald green designer gown looked utterly ridiculous in the harsh flashing lights of the police cruisers parked outside. She stared at the uniformed officers with wide, unblinking eyes. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. She was a woman who believed that people in her tax bracket simply did not get arrested. She thought the law was something that only applied to the poor and the desperate. She was about to receive a very aggressive education in reality. "Chloe Rollins." Detective Miller announced, his deep voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Step forward and keep your hands where I can see them." Chloe physically recoiled, pressing her back against the wooden banister. "What is happening?" she shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "Why are the police in my house? You cannot be here. I demand that you leave immediately. I know the mayor. I will have all of your badges for this outrage. You do not own this house, Mrs. Rollins." Detective Miller replied, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "And you are in absolutely no position to demand anything. You are under arrest." He pulled a heavy folded document from his jacket pocket. He read the charges loud and clear, ensuring that Julian and Richard heard every single devastating word. You are being charged with felony wire fraud. You are being charged with identity theft and the forgery of a financial instrument. You are also being charged with grand larceny and the trafficking of stolen goods across state lines. That is a lie, Chloe screamed, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over her carefully applied makeup. It is a lie. That crazy old man is making things up because he is senile and jealous of us. He abandoned his junk in the garage and I just cleaned it up. I did not forge anything. Detective Miller did not even blink. We have the digital tracking data from the insurance company proving the fraudulent loan application was sent from your personal laptop, he stated coldly. We have the bank routing numbers showing you attempted to deposit $50,000 stolen dollars directly into your private checking account. And we have crystal clear high-definition video footage of you standing in that garage signing a fraudulent bill of sale and accepting illegal cash for antique items you did not own. The undercover broker you sold them to works directly with our financial crimes unit. The color completely drained from Chloe's face. The arrogant fire that had fueled her entire life was instantly extinguished by the freezing water of undeniable evidence. She looked at me standing quietly across the room. She finally realized the absolute magnitude of the trap she had walked blindly into. I had not just caught her stealing. I had meticulously documented her entire criminal process and handed it to the authorities on a silver platter. Two uniformed officers stepped forward. They grabbed her arms and pulled them roughly behind her back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed through the grand foyer. It was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 10 years. Chloe broke down completely. Her knees buckled and the officers had to hold her up by her arms to keep her from collapsing onto the marble floor. She sobbed hysterically, begging Julian to do something, begging her father to call a lawyer. Her designer dress was wrinkled and stained with her own tears. The self-proclaimed lady of the manor was being dragged out of the front doors like a common thief. While Chloe was screaming, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Richard, the proud aristocrat, the man who had ordered me out of my own home, was attempting to slip away. While the police were focused on his daughter, he was literally tiptoeing toward the hallway that led to the catering kitchen and the back exit. He was abandoning his own child to save his own pathetic skin. I simply nodded my head toward the hallway. Sterling raised his hand. Two massive corporate security guards who had entered the house right behind the police immediately stepped forward. They intercepted Richard before his trembling hand could even touch the doorknob. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his leased tuxedo and dragged him roughly back into the center of the living room. Richard did not put up a fight. He just whimpered, keeping his head down, completely stripped of his dignity. He was a coward down to his very bones. Julian had watched his entire world disintegrate in the span of 5 minutes. He watched his wife get dragged out the front doors in steel handcuffs. He watched his father-in-law get manhandled by private security. He looked around the empty living room, surrounded by half-empty champagne glasses and discarded plates of caviar. The lavish life he had sacrificed his soul to maintain was completely dead. He could not take the weight of it anymore. Julian collapsed. He dropped to his knees right there on the cold marble floor. He did not just fall, he crumbled. He crawled across the polished stone toward me. He actually crawled like a beaten dog. He reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the hem of my tailored trousers. Dad, he wept. His face was a hideous mess of sweat and tears. Dad, please, please stop this. Please tell them to let Chloe go. I am so sorry. I was blind. I was weak. I will do whatever you want. I will kick Richard out right now. We can fix this. We can be a family again. Just, please, Dad. I am begging you to fix this. I looked down at the 40-year-old man crying at my feet. I searched my heart for any lingering trace of pity, any small spark of a father's forgiveness. I found absolutely nothing. The well was completely dry. The love I had for him died the moment he watched his wife throw his mother's ashes onto the wet grass and said nothing. I took a deliberate step backward, forcing his hands to fall away from my suit. I looked him dead in the eye with a coldness that made him physically shiver. I gave you a chance, Julian, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through his sobbing like a razor blade. I sat in a filthy $40 motel room and I offered you an absolute lifeline. I told you that if you stood up like a man and defended your father, I would make all your debts disappear. I offered you salvation, but you chose cowardice. You looked me in the eye and told me to go rot in an assisted living facility so you could keep playing house with a woman who was actively stealing your future." Julian sobbed harder, burying his face in his hands. "You do not have a father anymore, Julian." I continued, my tone devoid of any emotion. "You traded me for an illusion. I'm not fixing this. This is the exact life you built for yourself. Now you get to live in the ruins of it." Detective Miller stepped forward, looking down at Julian and Richard with profound disgust. "The property now legally belongs to Rollins Development," the detective stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You are both actively trespassing. You have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal belongings. You are only permitted to take what you can physically carry in your own hands. After 60 minutes, my officers will clear this building. Anyone remaining inside will be arrested and charged with criminal trespassing." I turned my back on my weeping son and his pathetic father-in-law. I walked over to the grand fireplace. I picked up the mahogany urn containing my beautiful Vivian. I held her close to my chest, knowing I had finally cleaned the infection out of our home. The execution was complete. Order had been restored. The garbage was finally being taken out. 6 months have passed since the night the flashing red and blue police lights washed over the pristine driveway of my property. The changing of the seasons brought a cold, crisp winter to the city, but my heart has never felt warmer or more secure. The sprawling house in the upscale gated community no longer smells like cheap catered caviar or expensive imported champagne. It smells like fresh paint, polished wood, and the sweet lavender perfume my beautiful Vivian always used to wear. The transformation of this space was not just physical. It was a complete spiritual cleansing. I completely gutted every single room that Chloe had arrogantly redecorated. I tore up the expensive imported rugs and threw away the ridiculous modern art she bought with stolen money. I reclaimed my territory entirely, but I did not move back into the massive, empty house to live alone. A property this size, built on a foundation of hard work, is meant to serve a much higher purpose than isolating one old man. I transferred the deed of the property from my commercial development firm to a newly established nonprofit organization. I officially named it the Vivian Rollins Foundation. We completely remodeled the entire ground floor. The master suite where Richard briefly and illegally squatted is now a fully functioning legal clinic. I hired Sterling Pierce to direct a team of ruthless, dedicated attorneys. We provide absolute free legal representation for senior citizens who are being financially abused and manipulated by their own toxic families. Every single day, elderly men and women walk through my front doors looking defeated, terrified, and completely broken. They are experiencing the exact same nightmare I went through. Their children are stealing their retirement pensions, forging their signatures, and trying to force them into state-run facilities just to steal their homes. My team listens to them. We protect them. We file the emergency injunctions, we freeze the compromised bank accounts, and we legally destroy the parasites who think old age equals weakness. Vivian would have absolutely loved this. She always believed that true wealth was measured strictly by how many vulnerable people you could protect. Protection comes with a very heavy price for those who try to break the rules. Chloe learned that lesson in the harshest environment possible. Her expensive defense attorney tried desperately to negotiate a plea deal, but the sheer volume of undeniable evidence we handed to the district attorney made that completely impossible. The high-definition video of her selling my antique tools and the digital tracking of the forged life insurance loan were absolute nails in her coffin. The judge was completely unforgiving during the sentencing hearing. He called her actions a masterclass in predatory greed. Chloe was convicted of felony wire fraud and elder financial abuse. She was sentenced to 7 years in a state penitentiary. The self-proclaimed lady of the manor traded her emerald green designer gowns for a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit. She sits in a small concrete cell completely stripped of her fake social status and her stolen luxury. The wealthy neighborhood wives she desperately tried to impress do not write her letters. They erased her from their memories the very second the police cruisers drove her away from my driveway. Julian and Richard avoided criminal charges, but their civil and financial reality is a miserable prison all its own. Julian lost his prestigious job at the corporate firm. The senior partners simply could not employ a man whose family was at the center of a massive public fraud and embezzlement scandal. Without his massive salary and with his bank accounts entirely drained to pay off the neighborhood fines and the initial legal fees, Julian was left with absolutely nothing. He was forced to rent a tiny rundown two-bedroom apartment in the absolute worst part of the city. And the most poetic part of his punishment is his new roommate. Julian is now living with Richard. The two men who thought they were fundamentally better than me are now trapped together in a damp, miserable apartment. Richard still owes over $1 million to violent underground bookies, and he refuses to get a real job. Julian is working 60 hours a week at a low-level logistics warehouse just to keep the lights on and buy cheap groceries for the man who helped ruin his life. Julian chose to protect Richard over his own father, and now he gets to spend the rest of his life paying for that cowardly decision. He calls my corporate office sometimes, leaving desperate voicemails, begging for a second chance, begging for a small loan just to get back on his feet. I never listen to them. I press delete and continue my day. The sun is starting to set over the gated community, casting long golden shadows across the pristine front lawn. I walk out onto the mahogany deck holding a cold glass of sweet tea. Sitting right there in its rightful place is the wooden porch swing. After Thomas secured my vintage tools in the storage facility, I had him track down the master carpenter who originally helped me build the swing decades ago. We carefully repaired the splintered armrest that Richard had carelessly destroyed. We sanded it down and painted it a fresh, pristine white. It looks exactly the way it did when Vivian and I used to sit here watching the neighborhood children ride their bicycles down the street. I sit down on the swing, feeling the sturdy wood support my weight. The heavy, suffocating burden of pretending to be a frail, helpless old man is completely gone. I look over at the small side table where the mahogany urn rests peacefully in the evening breeze. "I kept my promise, Vivian," I whisper to the quiet air. "I cleaned up our house. I protected what we built. I did not let them destroy our legacy." I take a slow sip of the sweet tea. My heart is completely still. I have zero regrets about the path I chose. Sometimes you have to burn a dead bridge to illuminate the path forward. I lost a son, but I saved my own soul, and I am using my strength to save hundreds of others. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and respect make you family. For too long, we tolerate disrespect from those we love, believing that suffering in silence is the ultimate sacrifice of a parent. But dignity is not a currency to be traded for temporary peace. When you allow arrogance and greed to trample over your kindness, you aren't protecting your children, you are helping them build their own prisons. Real power isn't always in the volume of your voice, but in the certainty of your boundaries. Walk away from toxic tables even if you paid for the meal. Did you enjoy my story? Let me know what you think about how I handled Julian and Chloe in the comments section below. Do you think Julian deserves a second chance, or did he get exactly what he deserved? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and truth. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to stand up for their own dignity. Thank you for listening.